Hello and welcome to the Tailwind Zero to Mastery course. In this course, we're going to be building out this landing page for a fictional music festival. And while we build out this landing page, we're going to be covering a whole bunch of Tailwind CSS features. Now, this landing page may look a little bit small. However, I'm confident that this course is one of the only courses that covers Tailwind CSS in such depth. Most Tailwind CSS courses, while they are really good courses, they only teach you how to create landing pages and styling your sites and things like that. And it doesn't go into more advanced concepts like creating dynamic and custom components and creating custom plugins for Tailwind CSS. So we are going to be covering all of that in this course. So we'll start off the course by creating our landing page layout with Flexbox and grid. We'll be looking at animations and custom animations. So you can see we've got this cool little waveform here, and this is a custom animation that we're going to create in the course. So we'll also be creating transitions as well as animations. We'll be creating a light and a dark mode. We can see here we've got a light and dark mode button, so we can toggle between the two here, light and dark mode. And we'll be creating this navigation bar at the top here with submenu items. We'll also be making sure that our site is fully responsive. So if we bring this down to a mobile screen size, we can see we've got a hamburger menu icon here, and we can open up the submenu items for that tickets menu item. So we'll be making sure that our site is fully responsive. So as well as those basic things, like I quickly touched upon just now, we'll also be looking at more advanced things like creating our own base, utility, and component styles, as well as creating our own custom plugins for Tailwind CSS to handle base styles, static and dynamic utilities, static and dynamic components, as well as variants. So don't worry if you don't understand anything of what I've just talked about just now, because we're going to be going over everything in this course and when to use each approach and the appropriate scenario to use each of those approaches. In this lecture, we're going to set up our Tailwind project. So I've already gone ahead and created a starter repo for this course, and it just contains a couple of packages, and it contains Font Awesome, and it contains all the images that we're going to need for building out our landing page. So it just means you don't have to download zips and npm install anytime we need to install a package or anytime we need to add assets to our project, because it's all available in the starter repo for this course. So let's go ahead then and clone this repo within VS Code. So I've opened up a new window and a new terminal in VS Code, and I'm going to cd into my web projects, and then I'm going to git clone https github.com/tomphil/tailwind-course-starter. And I've already got it cloned on my machine, so that's why I'm getting this error here. However, this command should clone into a new directory called tailwind-course-starter. So then we want to cd into tailwind-course-starter and open this up in VS Code with code dot, and this will open up our starter repo in a new VS Code window. So from here, you're going to need to npm I to install all the relevant npm packages. And I highly recommend you have 3 extensions installed in VS Code. The first is Prettier. So Prettier essentially just automatically formats our code anytime we save our changes in a file. And the other extensions I recommend you install is the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense. So this means we don't need to memorize all of the available classes in Tailwind CSS, because this IntelliSense will pop up whenever we need to use a particular class, and we can select it from the IntelliSense. So as a quick example, in index.html, if I have a div element here and I add a class, within these quotes then, if I type, for example, BG, and I hit Control and space, this will show the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense, and we can see we've got all the available Tailwind CSS classes that we can select from this IntelliSense. So we've got all these background colors based on this BG that we've started typing for this class. So that's what the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense plugin does. So before we actually start writing some HTML then and CSS, I want to show you this package.json. So the Tailwind CSS CLI will output a CSS file based on our input CSS file. So I've created a script here that we can run called tw::build, which will run the npx tailwind css CLI, and it will take the input CSS and output it to output CSS. And with this watch flag as well, it means anytime we modify input CSS, it will automatically go ahead and rebuild output CSS. So the reason we need an input CSS and an output CSS is because we're going to be extending Tailwind CSS ourselves. So for sure, Tailwind CSS comes with a bunch of built-in classes that we can use out of the box. And if we take a look at input.css, we're using the Tailwind directive here to essentially import all of these Tailwind CSS classes. Now, the base components and utilities are fairly simple concepts to understand, and they're just really an organization technique that Tailwind CSS uses. So base essentially contains all the reset CSS for our HTML, and it makes sure that all our styles are consistent across all browsers. So it resets all our CSS. So that also means any heading tags H1 to H6, they will all be exactly the same font size, for example, as paragraph tags. So it literally resets the entire CSS, so it's starting from a clean slate. So before we take a look at components, I will describe the utilities. So Tailwind CSS utilities are the vast majority of classes that we use from Tailwind CSS. So that is things like adding a background color. So to add a background color, we can add bg dash and then choose any built-in out-of-the-box color that comes with Tailwind CSS. So for example, if we choose this bg red 300, for example, and we hover over this class name, because we've got the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense plugin installed, if we hover over the class name, it will show us the CSS generated by Tailwind CSS, as well as the class name. So all of these classes that we're going to use are utility classes. So for example, if I wanted to add a font size, I can go text large here, for example. And again, if I hover over the text large class, the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense extension will display the class name as well as the CSS that it will generate for that class name. So we can see a text of large will create a font size of 18 pixels. So you can see from these utility classes then, the vast majority of them only ever set one CSS property. So in a sense, these classes are atomic. They're very, very small classes that usually only set one or two CSS properties for that particular class. So what happens then if we wanted this to be a button? So for example, we wanted a button class. Well, Tailwind CSS doesn't come with a button class because a button isn't an atomic class. So utility functions essentially are atomic classes because they only set one or two CSS properties. However, with a button, we could have a bunch of different CSS properties set. So this is why a button, if we go back to our input.css, would be a type of Tailwind component. And again, these are essentially just naming conventions and groups that we can use to add our different classes to. So later on in the course, when we do create a button class with Tailwind CSS, we're going to let Tailwind CSS know that this is a component class. So it belongs in the component group. Now, the reason we have these different types of grouping is so Tailwind also knows the levels of specificity that can override a particular CSS property or a particular class. For example, a component class can override base styles, and utility classes can override both components and base styles. So back again in our example, let's pretend we had a button component, but we wanted to change the text size from the default text size that we associate with this button. So we could add a text 5XL, for example, and this will give a font size of 48 pixels. So this utility class will be overriding the component class. So this is why we need an input CSS to make sure all our classes are compiled with Tailwind CSS, and then Tailwind will compile that into our output CSS, which will be created in a build folder. So if we go back to package.json, we can see that the build folder here, we're going to set to dist. So it's going to be dist/output.css. So we don't have it here at the moment, but if we go ahead and run npm run tw::build, we can see that this build process is running. And now we can see we have a dist folder with an output.css. Now, if we take a look at this output CSS and we scroll down, we can see that this is all of the reset CSS that Tailwind base styles come with. But if we scroll down, we might expect then, because if we take a look in our input.css, we might expect to see components and utility classes in the output.css. So if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, all the way past this reset CSS, and we get to the bottom, we can see that we don't actually have all that many utility or component classes. And that is because Tailwind CSS is very intelligent in that if we don't have any Tailwind CSS classes set within our HTML, then it's not going to include it in the build process for the output.css. So it's only ever going to include class names that we actually use for our final CSS build. So this is the other advantage to Tailwind CSS, in that it's got optimization built in out of the box. So now that we've gone over a quick overview of this project and Tailwind CSS, let's actually go ahead and start building out our landing page, starting with the header navigation menu. We're going to start building out our landing page, and we're going to start with this navigation menu at the top of our page. So let's go back to our code, and quickly before we start writing HTML and CSS, I want to quickly point out that in index.html, let's remove this div from the last lecture. So in index.html, we're actually referencing the output CSS that we went over in the last lecture. So all of the compiled CSS that we're outputting to dist and output CSS, we're referencing in our index.html file. And the other thing that I didn't mention in the last lecture is when we run, if we go to our package.json, when we run this tw:/build command, where we've got this watch flag, so we're watching for our input CSS, any changes in our input CSS, and then outputting it to output.css. We're also watching for files that we reference in our Tailwind config. So for example, with that watch flag, we're going to watch for any files that change that match the criteria in this content array. So we can see we've got a content array here that's referencing directories with a catch-all in here. So we're referencing any files within the source directory and any subdirectories within that source directory. And we're referencing the files that end in HTML and JS. So anytime we have files in the source directory that end in HTML and JS, and those files contain Tailwind classes, then those Tailwind classes will then be included in our output.css. So remember, in the last lecture, I told you that Tailwind CSS only includes the classes that we actually use in our project. So we have to set up which files to watch for in our Tailwind config within this content array. So then Tailwind will watch for any of these files with an HTML or JS extension. And if those files change and contain Tailwind CSS classes, then Tailwind will go ahead and rebuild to the output CSS and contain those new Tailwind classes. So with that said then, in index.html, let's go ahead and add a main tag in here. And within the main tag, we'll add a header tag. And then within the header tag, we'll add a nav tag. Now it's this nav tag that is going to be responsible for rendering this sort of pink color and all of the navigation items, as well as our logo. So let's go ahead and start building this out then. So we want our nav tag to stick to the top of the page. So we can use the position sticky for this. And in Tailwind CSS, we can just use the sticky class. So we can see if we hover over the class name again with the Tailwind IntelliSense extension installed, we can see that it's going to render this position sticky. So then we want to make sure that it's at the top of the page. So we want to set top to 0. And we want that nice pink gradient color that we saw in the completed project. So to do gradients in Tailwind CSS is really easy. We just need to set the BG gradient class name, and then we need to specify the direction of the gradient. So we want the BG gradient to go to the right. So we can go to R here. So we've got BG gradient to R. If we wanted to go to the bottom right, we could go to BR, which would be the bottom right. The top right would be TR, and I'm sure you can guess what the bottom left and the top left class names will be. So that is BL for bottom left, and then top left would be TL. So we can see when we add these class names, then we can see the linear gradient is going to be to the bottom left. So this is the generated CSS, but we want it to go just to the right. So we can see here it's going to right, and then we need to specify the color that the gradient will start at and the color that the gradient will end at. So for this, we need to add a from class. So we can go from and then the color that we want to gradient from. So we want it to be rose 500. So we want the 500 shade of rose that comes out of the box with Tailwind CSS. And then we want to go to pink-500. So we want that 500 shade of pink. So let's just go ahead and add some test text in here in the nav tag. So then if we right click on our index.html, let's go ahead and open in default browser. And we can see here we've got our nice gradient from our rose 500 to our pink 500. So before we go any further, let's go ahead and inspect our output.css. So now if we scroll down right to the bottom of our output CSS, and if we scroll up a little bit from the bottom, we can see now we've got some extra class names in here. We've got a BG gradient 2R because we've included it in our index.html. We've got the from rose 500 and the to pink 500. So these classes are now being included in our output CSS because Tailwind CSS has already picked up that we're using them in our index.html because we told Tailwind to watch out for any of the HTML and JS files within our source directory that potentially contain Tailwind CSS classes. So before we continue adding the logo and the menu items, let's hover over this top for a second, and we can see we have a top of 0 here. So spacing and positioning in Tailwind CSS is very easy. We just need to specify a particular value. For example, top 0 will obviously set the top to 0, but if we added top 1, for example, we can see in the IntelliSense here, we can see it's going to add a top of 4 pixels. Let's go top 2, we can see it's going to add a top of 8 pixels. Top 3, it's going to add a top of 12 pixels. So we can see all of these are in multiples of 4, which means we're not specifying any magic values and magic numbers and things like this when designing with Tailwind CSS, because we're essentially constrained to this 4 pixel grid. So it's exactly the same if we change this back to top 0 because we want top 0. It's exactly the same for margin and padding. So for example, padding, we just add P here. And if we want a padding all round, we can add a P-1, which will give a padding all round of 4 pixels, padding -2 or P-2, which will give a padding all round of 8 pixels, etc, etc. So it all goes up in multiples of 4. So we're sticking with this nice design constraint here in a nice 4 pixel grid. So we haven't got things all over the place with no structure in pixels and things like that. We're designing in this nice sort of 4 pixel grid. And generally what I find as well is I tend to stick with a couple of the same types of values. For example, I'll very rarely use P1, P2, P3, P4, and P5 in a project. I'll generally use things like P2 and P4. Exactly the same with margins as well. I'll generally stick with the same margins and padding for all of my different elements on the page. So if we wanted to add a padding, for example, to the left, we just add PL and dash. And exactly the same, we've got that 4 pixel constraint here with our different values. Padding to the right is done by PR, padding to the top is PT, and padding to the bottom is PB. Exactly the same with margins. We've got M for margin all round, we've got ML for margin left, MT for margin top, MB for margin bottom, and MR for margin right. So as well as specifying a particular side that we want to add some spacing to, we can also specify an X and Y axis. So for example, if we wanted a margin on the top and bottom, we could add an MY, so we're targeting the Y axis. If we wanted a margin on the left and right, we could target MX, which targets the X axis, so we're adding margin to the left and right. And again, we can see in the IntelliSense here that it's going to generate this CSS for this particular class name. So for example, MX0 will add a margin left and right of 0. And let's go down to MX4, for example, and we're adding a margin left of 16 pixels and a margin right of 16 pixels. So we don't actually want to add any spacing to this nav because we're going to add the spacing to our inner elements, for example, the logo and our navigation items and things like that. So we're not going to add any spacing to the nav. However, now we know how we can add spacing in Tailwind CSS. So before we finish up this lecture, let's go ahead and add our logo. So we want our navbar to display flex because we want all of the inner elements in our navbar to display in a single line. So let's remove this test text then, and let's add a div in here. And within this div, this is where we want to add our logo. And specifically, if we take a look at the completed project, we want to add our white logo because we've got two different logos here. We've got our pink logo and our white logo. So in the navbar, we want to go ahead and add the white logo. So in this div then, let's go ahead and add an image tag. And the source we want to set to /assets/images/logo inverted.png. And let's go ahead and specify a width here of 50. So then we want to go ahead and add our little logo text. So this is actual text and it's not part of the logo image. So before we add that, then let's go ahead and save our index.html. Let's go back to our browser and let's hit Command R or Control and R to reload the page. And we can see we're adding our inverted logo here. However, it's looking way too big. So let's go ahead and fix that in our code. And I've accidentally added width instead of width. So it should be width with a D there. And we want to set that to 50. So let's go ahead back in our browser and hit Command R to refresh. And there we go. We've got our inverted logo rendering here. So let's go ahead and add our logo text. So back in our code then, for this div, we want to set this div to display flex as well, because we want the image and our logo text to display horizontally on the same line. So then we want our items to display center, which will align our items centrally on the vertical plane. So it means our text, for example, if we take a look in the browser again, our text isn't going to be aligned right at the top here. It's going to be aligned centrally to the image vertically. So if we take a look at the completed project, we can see we've got vertical alignment here of our text compared to our image. And it's not right at the top of the navbar or right at the bottom. It's centrally aligned, and that is being set using the items center class. So this is specific to flex items. So then we want to go ahead and add some spacing. So I'm going to go ahead and add a padding all around of 2, which will give a padding of 8 pixels all around. And I want to add a gap of 2 as well, which will give a gap of 8 pixels between our image and the text we're about to render now. So let's go ahead and add another div element here. And it's within this div element that we want to add our logo text. So it's between this image and this div with the logo text where we're going to have our gap of 8 pixels. So for this, we want to add a class. And we want our text to be bold, so we can add the font bold class here, which will give a font weight of 700. And we want slightly larger text than the default text, so we can add a text 2XL here, which will give a font size of 24 pixels. So let's go ahead and add our logo text then. We want to start with the TW colon. And if we take a look at the completed project, we can see we've got TW colon in a white color. And then the MF for Music Festival is a dark blue color. So we want to add that MF then in a span tag because we want to change the color of this span tag. So let's go MF in here and let's add a class in here. And we want the text color to be different for MF. So I'm just going to add a text color here of text sky 900. So we'll have this nice dark blue text color here. Just go ahead and save this and take a look in the browser at our localhost. We can see we're rendering our logo and our logo text correctly. However, we need to update our TW text color to a white color, and it's a little bit difficult to notice, but we also need to update the font family. So we want to pick a nice font family from Google Fonts and not use the default browser font. So we'll take a look at that in the next lecture, but to finish off this lecture, let's go ahead and update this text color. So back in our code then, we want all the text color in our header to be a white color. So I'm going to choose a text color of Zinc 200. Which will give a nice off-white color here. So let's go ahead and save this. And now let's take a look in the browser and give it a refresh. And there we go. We've got our white text color for our logo text. So in the next lecture then, let's continue building out this header. And we're going to add some Google Fonts to apply to our entire landing page. So we're going to implement Google Fonts into our Tailwind project. So if we head on over to fonts.google.com, and we're going to select the Quicksand font. So let's go ahead and do a search for Quicksand. Let's select the Quicksand font family and let's scroll down and let's just go ahead and select all of these font variations. So from the thin to the bold, and then in the right hand pane here, we can then see we've got Quicksand selected and all of these font variations selected. So we want to go ahead and use the import statement to import our Google font. And let's go ahead and copy the import statement without copying the style tag. So we just want to copy this import statement here. So I'm going to copy that to my clipboard. Then I'm going to head on over back to my code. And in our input.css, above the Tailwind directives, we just want to paste our import at the top. So we're going to import our Quicksand font family into our input.css. So let's go ahead and save this. And to be able to apply this Quicksand font to our entire Tailwind app then, we can go ahead and create our first custom base style. So to do this, we want to use the layer directive and we want to target the base layer. So then we want to target the HTML tag and we want to set the font family on the HTML tag to quick sand, comma, sans dash serif. Now let's go back to our Google Fonts and make sure if we scroll down below the import statement, then we can see here we've got this font family as well. So we could have easily just copied this font family style and pasted it in, instead of typing it manually, pasted it in for our HTML tag. Now, the reason we want to add the style and the font family to the HTML tag within this base layer is, again, for the order of specificity within Tailwind. So remember, utilities can override both components and base styles, and components can only override base styles. So that's the reason we want to group our styles in this way. And remember, base styles should only ever target HTML tags. Base styles, usually we don't want to target classes in the base styles. We just want to target HTML tags. And the HTML tag we want to target for our font family is the tag HTML. So if we go ahead and save this then, and we take a look back in our project in the browser and we give it a refresh, and there we go. You might have seen the subtle change there to our Google font. So in the next lecture then, we're going to continue building out our navigation, and we're going to be adding our menu items as well as our submenu item. So we're going to continue building out our navigation by adding these menu items. So if we go back to our code in index.html, we want to go ahead and add another div within our nav tag, and we want this div to fill the remaining space of this nav tag. So where we've got this first div here, because the nav tag is displaying flex, this first div here is only ever going to grow to the size of its contents. So if we take a look in the browser at our project, and if we inspect the element for our logo, and if we select the top level div tag here within the nav tag, we can see that the width of this div is only ever the width of its contents. So then we want another div here. So this second div here, we want it to span the entire or the remaining width of this navbar. So to do that, if we go back to our code, we can add a flex of 1 here, which will mean this div will fill the remaining space of this navbar. And then we want to make sure that this is display flex as well, because then we want to align our items centrally. So this align items here. So an align items of center will mean it will align vertically within the navbar. Then we want to justify end, which means all of the children within this div will shift to the right hand side, so it'll shift to the end of the navbar. So this second div is going to span the entire width or the entire remaining width of the navbar, and because we're going to display flex on this div and then we add the justify end for those children within the div, it's going to shift the children all the way over to the right hand side. So back in our code then, let's go ahead and add our menu items. So the first menu item is going to have the label of home. So let's go ahead and save this and take a look in the browser first. Let's give it a refresh just to make sure that our styles have been applied correctly and the menu items are indeed being shifted to the right hand side. So that's looking great so far. So for our first menu item then, we want to add a bunch of classes. So the first class is going to be relative, and the reason we want to add a relative class and want to add these to all of our menu items is because if we take a look at the completed project and our tickets menu with the submenu items are going to be displaying absolute, which means the top level menu item needs to have a position of relative, because the submenu items are going to have a position of absolute, and then we can position this absolute submenu item relative to this ticket's main menu item. So that's the reason we want to add a relative class to our menu items. So then we want to add a display of flex. We want to add a h full, which will give this a height of 100%. So if we take a look in the completed project, it means this menu item will span from the top down to the bottom in height. And then we're adding a display flex because we want this label to centrally align vertically and horizontally within this menu item. So then let's go ahead and add those classes. We want an items center, which again will align our items centrally on the vertical axis. Then let's give it a padding all round of 4, which will be 16 pixels. Let's give it a cursor of pointer. We want a font bold, and let's give it a text color of a slightly off-white pink. So let's go text pink 200. So let's save this now before we add any more classes and take a look in the browser. Let's give it a refresh, and there we go. We can see we've got our cursor when we hover over the menu item. From here, what we'd like to do is add some background color whenever we do hover over the menu item. And then we want to make sure our text color for the label is a slightly lighter white, just so it highlights it a little bit more. You might not be able to see it from the video, but when we hover over this text, it does actually produce a whiter color than what we've given it here. So we've given it, when we don't hover over the label, we've given it a text pink of 200. When we hover over it, we want to give it a text zinc of 200, as well as this really light pink background color. Now this light pink background color, we can actually do this with an opacity and a white color. So a slightly translucent white color. Let's go ahead and add that first then. So to target styles, whenever we hover over a particular element, we can use the hover selector. So we can go ahead and add any Tailwind class, exactly like what we've been doing before, adding all these classes in. We can just specify a class that we want to apply whenever we hover over this particular element. So we can add multiple hover selectors to an element. So first of all, let's go ahead and change the text color. Let's go text zinc of 200. So when we're not hovering over this menu item, the text will be pink 200. And when we hover over the menu item, the text will be zinc 200. So let's go ahead and add that background color then. So again, we can add any number of hover selectors to add multiple classes whenever we do hover over a particular element. So then we want to add a background color now. So let's go BG white, but instead of a background of white, we want it to be slightly transparent. So then we can use the slash here, the /, and this will give a transparency as well. So let's go ahead and select the /10. So this will give it a 10% opacity. So let's go hover, BG white /10. Let's give this a save and take a look in the browser now. Give it a refresh and let's hover over our menu item, and there we go. That's looking great. However, this is a little bit too janky. If we take a look at the completed project, we can see when we hover over a particular menu item, the background transition and the color is a little bit smoother. So this is where we can add a transition to our menu item. So let's go back to our code then, and let's add a transition of colors. So this will target the text color, background color, all the colors associated with this particular element. We'll make sure we apply a transition to them. So then we can then specify what type of transition we want. We can have an ease in, an ease out, an ease in out. We could also have a ease linear, for example. So I'm just going to use the ease in out transition, and I'm going to save this now and take a look in the browser again, give it a refresh, and let's hover over our menu item now, and there we go. We can see the nice transition for that background color. So in the next lecture, we're going to add the remaining items for our menu items, and we're going to look at techniques that we can use to help with development of these types of components, because there's a bunch of class names associated with this particular menu item. What if we had, let's say, 5 menu items, but then we wanted to change the styling for all of those 5 menu items? Instead of having to edit the class names individually for each individual menu item, we're going to go over a technique in the next lecture, which will make updating multiple elements of the same type, so for example, multiple menu items, it will make updating those a lot easier. So we're going to finish off our top level menu items, and we're going to look at a couple of techniques we can use in VS Code to make editing multiple items a lot easier than editing each item manually. So first of all, let's head on back to our code, and in our index.html, let's go ahead and add our missing menu items. So the remaining menu items are the lineup, tickets, and support. So let's go ahead and add those in then. First of all, I'm going to wrap the home label in a span tag. So what we can do here then is we can just copy the first menu item and paste it for our remaining menu items. So we'll have home, lineup, tickets, and support. So we can go home, lineup, tickets, and support. So let's save this and take a look in the browser now and give it a refresh. And there we go, we've got our main menu items here. So what happens then if we go back to our code, we've got all these class names, we're duplicating all this extra code. What happens then if we want to update all of our menu items and apply the same update to all of our menu items? So for example, let's say we wanted to increase or decrease the padding for each of our menu items. So instead of going to each single padding class here and updating it to, let's say, P2 instead of P4, and then going down each of our menu items and updating it manually, what we can do is use a shortcut in VS Code, which will allow us to add multiple cursors and edit in multiple places at the same time. So on Mac, we can hold down the Option key on the keyboard and just click wherever we want our additional cursor. And on Windows, we need to hold down the Alt key and click where we want to add our additional cursor. So I've clicked just before this 2 here in exactly the same position as the first one I had selected with the cursor. So I'm going to go ahead and select all the relevant menu items there. And we can see now the cursor is blinking in 4 different places for each of our menu items. So now we can use all of our keyboard keys and it will update in all of those cursor positions. So if I wanted to update the padding then for each of these, I could update it to 4. I could update it to any value. It doesn't really matter. I could delete font bold, for example, if I wanted to. And all of those changes are going to happen in all of those instances where I've got my cursors. So I'm going to add the font bold back in, and you can just click anywhere within the file window to deselect all of those multiple cursors. So now we're just back to just one cursor. So another shortcut, which is very similar, and that's a way to add multiple cursors, is if we had, for example, a div here, and let's for the moment pretend we don't have any of these menu items. And let's say we wanted to add our menu items here. So I'm just copying and pasting all these divs. And again, instead of holding down Option and clicking for the multiple cursors, what I can do here is I can point where I want my first cursor to be, and I can hold down Option and Command and use the arrow key. So I'm using the down arrow key here to select all in line, and then I could add some class names. And this will be where we add all of our class names for our menu items. So if you're on Windows, the exact same command, if you want to add multiple cursors via clicking, is holding down Alt. And then when you hold down Alt, then you want to click in the particular position you want your new cursor to be. And exactly the same for the technique. Instead of clicking, where on Mac we hold down Option and Command and use the down arrow key or the up arrow key to select a particular position, on Windows we can use Control Alt and down or up. So we can hold down Control Alt and hit the down key and it does exactly the same thing. So one thing I'll note as well is, let's remove all these example divs here. One thing I'll note as well is, if we're using a front-end framework like Vue or React, then we'd usually refactor this out into a separate component. So we'd never really be duplicating all of these class names and adding all of these menu items in line, because we just create one single menu item component and then we'd just render it. So for example, we'd have a menu item component, and within this menu item component, all of these classes will just be referenced once within that menu item component. And then we'd render that menu item component multiple times. And then maybe we'd have a prop that we pass into it, something like label. And then the first one would be home, and the second one would be lineup, etc., etc. So in frameworks like Vue and React, it's very rare that we'd be duplicating all of these class names for things like menu items and all of our common components, because we just contain it in one place. It would just be housed in one place and specified in one place, and that is within the component itself. However, if you're not using something like Vue or React, where you have components where you can specify just once all of these class names, so maybe you're building out a WordPress theme or maybe a Shopify theme or something like that, or you're building out something that doesn't support this component type architecture, and you have no choice but to display all your things like menu items all in one line like this and not refactor it out into a component, then this is a good candidate to use components from Tailwind. So in my opinion, components from Tailwind are more of a kind of last resort to use. You should always, if you're using Vue and React and front-end frameworks like that, you should always move these types of common markup into a component. However, if you can't do that, then the sort of last resort is a Tailwind component. So to create a Tailwind component is super easy. What we can do is in input.css, exactly like what we've done with the layer directive here, targeting the base layer, we can do exactly the same and target the components layer. So it's within this components where we can create some component classes. So an appropriate name for the component we want to create now is a menu item. So instead of repeating all of these class names here, we can go ahead and specify just once in one place all of these class names and apply it to all of our menu items. So let's go ahead then and create a menu item class. So for this, we want to write some CSS. So we just want to go menu-item here, and we want to apply all of the relevant Tailwind CSS classes to this menu item. So for example, we want to apply all of these classes that we've already specified within our markup, and we want to apply all of these classes to a single class called menu item. So let's go ahead and select all those class names there. Let's go ahead and copy those class names. And in input.css then, for the menu item, we can go ahead and use the apply directive that comes out of the box from Tailwind, followed by all of the class names we want to apply to this particular menu item component class. So let's go ahead and paste all of those Tailwind CSS class names for our menu item. Let's go ahead and save this now. And let's go ahead and refactor our index.html. And instead of specifying all those class names, let's go ahead and combine what we've just learned now by selecting multiple cursors or creating multiple cursors. So I'm going to hold down Option on my Mac. If you're using Windows, you want to hold down Alt, and we're going to click at the start of each of these class names here. Then I'm just going to go ahead and delete all of these class names. And then I just want to apply a single class called menu-item. So if we save this now, and now we take a look in the browser, let's go ahead and give it a refresh, and nothing should have actually changed because it's exactly the same classes being applied within this menu item class in input.css. It's all these same classes that we're applying. However, we're just adding them to a single class name now called menu item. Now, one downside to this is it's going to increase our output CSS. So whereas before we're using in multiple places all of these class names, we're now adding another class name to add to our output CSS called menu item. So using components in this way will increase your bundle size and potentially increase it by quite a bit. That's why it's always recommended, if you're using things like Vue or React, it's always recommended to just use the utility classes within Tailwind CSS, and you don't need to create these component classes if you're using a front-end framework like Vue and React. However, if you're not using a component-based framework, then you can go ahead and use these components in Tailwind CSS. You can create these components in Tailwind CSS. However, I do recommend that you use these as a last resort. If you can get away without using components, I highly recommend that you don't use them because they do and can contribute to larger output CSS files. So with that said, now that we've covered a bunch of different editing techniques within VS Code, now that we've covered components in Tailwind CSS, we can go ahead and continue and finish off our navbar. If we take a look in the completed project, we just need one thing now to finish off this navbar for the desktop view, and that is the submenu item. So in the next lecture, we'll take a look at these submenu items, and then we'll go ahead and start looking at our mobile navbar, where we've got this burger menu icon here with this nice little transition between open and close, as well as opening up the mobile menu and the mobile submenu. So we're going to implement our submenu items for our tickets menu. So let's go back to our code, and for our index.html, for the tickets menu item, we want to go ahead and add a div underneath this span, and it's within this div that we're going to add our submenu items. So for now, let's just add something like submenu items in this div, just so we've got some text we can work with and we can actually see something rendering on the screen. So we want to give it a background pink of 500 and a position of absolute and a top of full. So if we save this now and take a look in the browser and give it a refresh, we can see now that because we've given it a position of absolute and because the tickets is position relative, so this tickets menu item is position relative and our submenu item here is position absolute, we're positioning our submenu items absolutely relative to our tickets menu item. So because we've given it a top of 100%, it means that our submenu item is now right at the bottom of this tickets menu item. So we also want to make sure that it's shifted all the way to the right hand side, and it looks like it is by default, but we want to 100% make sure that this is the case. So we can go ahead and also add, as well as a top full, we want to add a right of 0. So adding a right of 0 means that it's going to hug the right hand side here, and it's going to be flush and in line with the right hand side of this tickets menu item. So we also want to make sure that each menu item doesn't wrap onto a new line like what we've got here. Our submenu items should all be in one line. So we don't want to wrap our submenu items onto separate lines. So to do that, we can add the white space no wrap class and take a look in the browser now and give this a refresh, and there we go. Our labels are no longer wrapping on multiple lines. So if we take a look at the completed project, we can see we've got this slight border radius on the bottom. So we can target the bottom borders then and the bottom border radius by going rounded B, which stands for rounded bottom. And we can see here we're going to have a border bottom right radius and a border bottom left radius. So let's give it a rounded bottom of MD. So we'll have a 6 pixel border radius on the bottom. Let's take a look in the browser now, and there we go. We can see our subtle border radius on the bottom. And finally, we want to add a text of right. So our text will be aligned to the right hand side. So from here then, let's go ahead and add our submenu items. So let's remove this submenu items example label, and let's add a div here. And within this div is going to be our first submenu item. So the first submenu item is single day ticket. And then let's just copy this div and paste it, and we want a 7-day ticket. So now we can go ahead and add some classes to both of these divs using the technique from the last lecture. If we hold down Option on Mac or hold down Alt on Windows and we click where we want to select multiple cursors, let's add some class names then. Let's go ahead and add a padding of 4 all round. Let's go ahead and add a font of bold. Let's add another background color, just like what we did for our main menu items. So on hover, let's add a background of white, and we want a slightly transparent white here. So let's give it a transparency of 5%. So we can go hover BG white /5. We want to do exactly the same as well for the text color. So let's go hover text zinc 200, just like what we did for the main menu items or the parent menu items. And again, let's go ahead and add a transition of colors and a ease in out transition. And of course we need a cursor of pointer, so people using our site know that they can actually click on this menu item. And we want a default text color as well of text pink 200. So then when we hover over it, then we have a text zinc of 200, just like our parent menu items. So let's save this now and take a look in the browser. Let's give it a refresh. And there we go. We can see we've got our nice submenu item here. However, the submenu item is constantly open. We want the submenu item to only open whenever we hover over this tickets menu item. So this is where we can use the group selector. So just like what we've done before with the hover selector, where we're targeting the hover state, we can also add a group selector. So let's go back to our code. And what we want to do is whenever we hover over this particular menu item, so whenever we hover over this div, we want to make sure that this particular div has a display of block. Otherwise, if we're not hovering over this particular menu item, we just want the div to be hidden. So first of all, let's give it a default state of hidden. So we can add the hidden class here to display none. Then what we can do is add something called a group in Tailwind. So if we add this group class to a particular parent element or an element higher up in the DOM, then we can target this via any ancestor element. So with this div, what we can do is add group here, dash hover. So whenever we're targeting the next available group ancestor, which is obviously this particular div here because we've got a group class attached to this div. So when the next available group ancestor is hovered over, then we can go display block. So let's save this now and take a look in the browser and give it a refresh. So by default, our submenu items are hidden. So if we hover over the tickets now, we can see that our submenu item is display block. So this is because we're using the group class on this particular div, and then we can target this particular div with the group class within any descendant elements by targeting the group dash hover and then adding any available styles to this particular div based on if the group is hovered or not. So obviously we're setting a display of block whenever this particular group is hovered over. So this pretty much concludes our navbar for the desktop version of our site. So in the next lecture, let's go ahead and take a look at how we can implement a mobile version of this navbar, starting with our mobile icon with this burger icon, transitioning into a close icon. So we're going to make a start on our mobile navigation, and we're going to start off by creating this mobile menu icon, transitioning to a close menu icon whenever we switch between the two open and closed states. So first of all, what we want to do is at a particular breakpoint, we want to hide the desktop navigation and then make the mobile navigation visible. So back in our code then, exactly like how we've used the hover and the group classes, we can also target various screen sizes via class names. So on the top level div here, what we can do is add a class of hidden, so which means our default state and default display for this particular div is hidden. And we can see here we've got some yellow underline on both of these classes because we have conflicting classes here. We have a display of flex and we have a display of none. So we do want the display of flex though on tablet screen sizes and above. So to target medium screen sizes or tablet screen sizes and above, we can use the MD selector followed by a colon, and again followed by any valid Tailwind CSS class. So we want to apply the display flex anytime we have a medium screen size and above. So let's take a look in the browser and give it a refresh just to make sure that this all works. So we can see if we take a look in the code, the minimum screen width for this to display flex is 768 pixels. So if we take a look here, we're on 609 at the moment. So let's increase the screen size above 768 pixels, and nothing's actually happening. And that is because I haven't saved the file. So I need to make sure I save my changes in index.html. Let's take a look back in the browser then. Let's give it a refresh. So we're on 772 now. What happens if we bring this screen size down to 767? So because the threshold is below 768 pixels, now this hides our desktop navigation. So at this point, we want to make visible a mobile navigation. So the mobile navigation will be displayed as default. So it's not going to be hidden as default. So if we go underneath this div then, the closing tag for our desktop navigation, let's go ahead and open another div. So this will be our mobile navigation. And actually, I'm just going to add this at the top. So I'm going to add my mobile navigation first, right after our logo. This is where I'm going to add my mobile navigation. So let's add a class name then of block as default. So it means it's going to display block as default. And then we want to target the medium screen size and above and set this as hidden. So on medium screen sizes and above, the mobile navigation will be hidden. So to test this out then, let's just add mobile nav in here, just so we can see something on the screen and it all working. So if we go back to our browser then and hit refresh, we can see the mobile nav is visible. And if I increase this to 768, we should see the mobile nav disappear and the desktop nav appear. So let's increase this by 1 pixel and there we go. We no longer have the mobile nav visible, but now we have the desktop nav visible. So let's reduce this screen size down again so we can start working more on the mobile nav. So what we want to do is create our mobile menu icon. So let's go back to our code then, and we want this to be positioned to the right-hand side of our nav. So for this, we need to add a margin left of auto. So this will shift the mobile nav to the furthest right-hand side of the navbar. Let's give it a padding right of 4. So that's 16 pixel padding on the right-hand side, just so it's not hugging the right-hand side of our navbar. We're having a little bit of spacing between the mobile icon and the end of the navbar. And let's give it a margin on the y-axis, so top and bottom of auto. So this will centrally align it vertically within the navbar. And we want to give it a cursor of pointer, so everyone knows when they're using our site that they can actually click on this icon. So now let's go ahead and actually create our burger mobile icon. So let's create some divs in here. We want 3 in total, and each of these divs is going to represent the line for each icon, or actually each line within the icon, I should say. So we'll have 3 divs here, so they'll represent each line. And let's go back to our code then and actually wrap each of those divs within a div. So there we go. So this is the icon wrapper here for our burger icon, and each of these is going to be each line within that icon. So let's go ahead and add some styling to each of these lines then. We want to add a background zinc of 200. We want to add a rounded of full. So this will give a nice border radius and a completely round border radius. If we take a look in the completed project, we have a nice completely rounded border radius for each of our lines. And let's give it a width of 8. So that'll be a width of 32 pixels. And then let's save this now and take a look in the browser just to see what we've got. And let's give it a refresh. And we can't actually see anything here because we haven't given each of these divs a height. So we also need to apply a height to each of these divs. So I'm just going to add a height of 1. So this will be 4 pixels. So let's take a look in the browser now and give it a refresh. And there we go. We can see we've got our lines here. However, we need some separation between the top, middle, and bottom lines. So for the middle line, I'm going to add a margin top of 1, as well as that bottom line, a margin top of 1. So this will give a 4 pixel spacing between each of our lines. So let's save this and take a look in the browser now and give it a refresh. And there we go, we have our burger icon. So in the next lecture then, we're going to start working on our transition. Whenever we click on the icon, that transition to the close icon. We're going to finish off our menu icon by creating a close icon and then transitioning to that close icon from this burger icon. So what we want to do is attach an ID to this particular div because this is the wrapper for our icon, for our mobile icon. So let's attach an ID here and let's call it mobile menu button. And what we want to do is attach a click handler to this mobile menu button. So whenever we click this div, we want to set a class of open. And when we have a class of open, this is where we modify these 3 lines on our burger icon. We want the first line to rotate 45 degrees. We want the third line to rotate minus 45 degrees. And we want the middle line to fade out. So if we take a look at the completed project, we can see that this is that type of transition. The top line rotates 45 degrees, the bottom line rotates minus 45 degrees, and the middle line disappears. So this is the type of functionality we want to imitate. So back in our code then, we've already taken a look at the hover selector and the screen size selector, as well as the group selector. And we want to do something similar with this mobile menu button. We want to add a class name for the mobile menu button, and we want to add a class name of group. So then when the group is open for any of these lines, then this is where we want to add our class names. So for example, where before we've used the group selector and we've used group dash hover colon and then any valid Tailwind CSS class. However, now we want to have a group dash open colon and then any valid Tailwind CSS class. Now, the open selector isn't available in Tailwind CSS, so this is something that we're going to have to create. So this is a great introduction into our very first Tailwind CSS plugin. So these are known as variants. Where we've got group dash open, this is known as a variant. And where we have hover colon, that is known as a variant. So we can create our own variants in Tailwind CSS, and this is a perfect candidate to use our own custom variant. So in our root directory then, let's go ahead and create a new folder, and we want to call it plugins, because we're going to be creating a few different kinds of plugins throughout this course. So we're going to house all of our plugins in this plugins directory. So the first plugin we want to create is an open variant. So we can type open variant here. So we'll create an open variant.js file, and we need to import the plugin function from Tailwind. So at the top here, we can go ahead and add const plugin, set that equal to require, and we want to import that from Tailwind CSS /plugin. Then we want to go ahead and create a const open variant, and this is where we're going to register and set up our custom Tailwind CSS variant. So let's go ahead and use that plugin function then to register this new plugin. And this plugin function takes a callback function, which will be passed a number of different helper functions that we can use to register our new class name. So the class name we want to register is a variant class name. So we can go ahead and use the add variant helper function that Tailwind CSS will provide to us in this callback function to our plugin function. So let's go ahead and destructure add variant then from the callback function. And let's go ahead and use that add variant function then. And the variant we want to create is group-open. Just like before where we had group-hover, now we're creating a group-open variant. So then the second argument to this function will be the class name definition for this variant. So it's essentially where we're going to set up the functionality on what is actually going to happen when this group-open class is applied to a particular element. So what we want to do is use the :merge from Tailwind CSS to merge two different class names. So we want to merge the .group class name, which already exists in Tailwind CSS, followed by .open, which is the new class name we're introducing as part of this open variant plugin. And then what we want to do is just add an ampersand at the end here. So that's pretty much it. The last thing we need to do now is just export this plugin. So it's a very simple plugin, but it's going to be very effective for our use case for our mobile menu icon. So to export this plugin then, we just need to type module.exports, set that equal to open variant. So let's save this now then. And in our tailwind.config.js, in our plugins array, let's go ahead and register this new plugin. So we can go ahead and require, and we want to require from /plugins/open variant. So now in our index.html, when we're applying our group-open class to this first line in our burger icon, we want to rotate this 45 degrees whenever the group also has a class name of open. However, we're going to dynamically set and remove this open class, so we're not going to add it in and hard code it in for this class name just yet. But what we want to do is for this first line in our burger icon, we want to rotate it 45 degrees. So let's go ahead and add a rotate 45, which is a Tailwind CSS class name, which will rotate, as we can see here in the generated CSS. It will rotate our div 45 degrees. Just go ahead and save this now. And before we take a look in the browser, obviously we need to add dynamically a class name to this mobile menu button div. So right at the top of our index.html, in our head tag, let's go ahead and add a script. And let's add a JavaScript event listener to that particular div. So we want to go window.onLoad and set this equal to a function. Then let's grab that div then by going const mobile menu icon and setting this equal to document.getElementById. And we want to pass the mobile-menu-button here, not icon. So I named it mobile menu button. If we scroll down and find this div then, it has an ID of mobile menu button. So let's scroll up then, and now that we've grabbed this mobile menu icon div, we can attach an event listener to it. So we want to attach a click event listener to it. So we can go mobile menu icon.add event listener, and we want to add a click event listener. Then within the handler then, we just want to check to see if the mobile menu icon has a class name of open. If it does have a class name of open, we remove that class name. If it doesn't have a class name of open, then we're just going to add that class name of open. So we can go mobile menu icon.classlist.contains and check to see if this mobile menu icon has a class of open. So if it does, we want to go mobile menu icon.classlist.remove open, else mobile menu icon.classlist.add open. So just go ahead and save this, and now we can take a look in the browser and let's give it a refresh and let's see what happens when we click on this icon. Then we can see that this top bar for our burger icon is rotated 45 degrees. However, we want to add this as a nice transition. We don't want it all janky where it's just immediately changing. So let's go ahead and add some transition then. If we scroll down to our burger icon, let's just go ahead and add a transition of all, and then let's go ahead and target the group open again for the middle bar or the middle line. Let's go group-open and just set the opacity to 0, so this will fade our middle bar out. But what we want to do is make sure that this has a default opacity of 100. So it's going to transition from 100 to 0 whenever the group is open. And then we want to do exactly the same as the first line in our burger icon. However, we want to invert the rotation. So we can go group-open again, minus rotate 45 degrees now. And again, we want to add the transition all to each of our bars. So let's go transition all to the middle one and transition all to that last one. So let's save this and take a look in the browser now. Let's give it a refresh and click on our icon. And there we go. That's looking great. However, what we need to do is shift the bottom bar up and the top bar down. So let's go ahead back in our code then, and again target the group open state. So let's go group dash open, and we want the top to come down by 8 pixels. And for this to actually apply, we need to add also a class of relative. So then for our last bar then, we want again group dash open, but we want this minus top 8 pixels, so minus top 2. And again, we need to add that relative class. Let's save this and take a look in the browser now and give it a refresh. And let's click on our icon, and there we go. We can see our nice transition between our open and close icon. So if we take a look at this icon, whenever we're clicking on it, it does also look a little bit janky compared to the completed project. It looks a lot smoother. And that is because we also need to add a default class of top 0 to that top and bottom bar. So let's just go top 0 for the top and bottom bar. Let's save this. And now if we take a look in the browser, let's give it a refresh, and that is a lot smoother, our transition, because it's now transitioning from top 0 rather than not actually having a top set. So in the next lecture then, what we want to do is hook up our functionality to actually display then our mobile menu whenever our mobile menu icon is set to open. So we're going to implement our mobile menu then. Whenever we click on our mobile menu icon, we want to make sure that our mobile menu appears. So to do this, we're going to do something very similar to what we did with the group. However, in Tailwind CSS, we also have a peer. So where we can target and add styles based on a peer elements state. So before we get into that though, let's actually implement the mobile menu, and then we'll implement the functionality of hiding it and showing it based on whether the mobile menu button is open or not. So underneath this mobile menu button div then, as a sibling, we want to add another div, and it's within this div that's going to display our mobile menu. So first of all, let's just add mobile menu in here just so we can see something on the screen. And we want to add a bunch of class names to this then. So we want a position of absolute. And just like our gradient for our navbar, we want to add a background gradient of rose to pink. So let's go BG gradient to R, so to the right. And we want to go from rose 500 to pink 500. Then we want to give it a width of full, so that'll give a width of 100%, and we want a left of 0. So let's save this and take a look in the browser. Now then, if we give our local project a refresh, we can see we have our mobile menu here. However, it's overlapping the icon. So ideally, because this is position absolute, we want the mobile menu to start right underneath our navbar. So it looks seamless whenever we open the mobile then, or the mobile menu. It looks seamless from the navbar gradient down to the mobile nav and the mobile menu. However, these are two separate divs, but it looks seamless in the way that we have a position of top. We're going to add a position of top, so it's just starting underneath the navbar. So it looks seamless. It looks like it's one element. So to do this then, we can go back to our code, and we want to add a top positioning to this mobile menu. However, we want to specify a specific value here. So whereas before we've added top dash and then we've stuck to our 4 pixel grid. So starting from top 1 is 4 pixels, and then it's always multiples of 4 all the way down to, let's see what the maximum is 96. So 96 times 4 is 384 pixels. So what happens then if we want a specific value instead of locking into the Tailwind CSS default grid system? So first of all, let's go ahead and add a top of 16 just to see if this top positioning works for our use case. So let's go ahead and save that and refresh, and we can see that we've got a little white space between the navbar and the mobile menu. So this isn't ideal. We want it to be seamless. So what we want to do then is we can see that this is going to add a top of 64 pixels. However, and I know this because I've already created it for the final project, so this is actually a 2 pixel gap in here. So we don't need to guess because I already know that this is a 2 pixel gap. So we need a top of 62 pixels rather than 64 pixels. So to specify any unit within Tailwind CSS is really easy. And this works for positioning, it works for margin, it works for width, it works for height. So anytime we have a top dash, for example, we can just open up a set of square brackets, and then within this square brackets, we can type any value and any unit we like. So we want a 62 pixel height. So if we hover over this, then we can see that Tailwind CSS is going to generate this class name. It's going to have a top 62 pixel class name, and then it's going to add a top of 62 pixels. So we could do this as well. It doesn't have to be pixels. It could be a percent if we wanted to. So if we add 62% in there, for example, we can see that it's going to add a top of 62%. However, we want pixels for our unit. So we want a top of 62 pixels. Let's go ahead and save this now and take a look in the browser, and let's give it a refresh, and there we go. Our mobile menu and our navbar now looks seamless. So before we add our mobile menu items then, let's go ahead and hook up the functionality where we open and close our mobile menu, and actually hook up the functionality where the mobile menu hides and displays whenever we toggle our mobile menu icon. So for this, what we can do is make use of the peer class within Tailwind CSS. So first of all, I'm going to show you what the peer class actually does. So this is just an example. We're not going to actually use this as our completed mobile navbar. However, I just want to show you the peer class first. So I'm going to go ahead and add a peer class to the mobile menu button. And then I'm going to add for the mobile menu a peer-hover, just like what we've done with the group and the group-hover classes. And then after the peer-hover, we can add any valid Tailwind CSS class. So what we could do is, for here, I just want to show you something really obvious. So I'm just going to add a background of black just as an example. So I'm going to save this now. So anytime we hover over this mobile menu button, because we have a peer class here, this mobile menu should now display a background of black. So let's go ahead and check this out in the browser then. If we hit refresh and we hover over our menu icon, and it doesn't seem to actually work, and that's probably because we have a gradient as well. So we're trying to change a gradient to a solid color. So I'm just going to go change this. Instead of BG black, let's go to black. So we're going to go from rose 500, and then whenever we hover over the mobile menu icon, we're going to change, instead of to pink 500, it's going to change to black. So let's save this now and take a look in the browser, give it a refresh and hover over now, and there we go. So this is working now. We can see anytime we hover over the mobile menu icon, our background color changes for the mobile menu. So we can do something very similar then to what we've done with the group and our custom variant. So where we've got our group open variant, we can do exactly the same for the peer open variant. So we can go ahead and create a custom peer open variant. So let's go ahead and do that then in the open variant. Because this is all part of the same functionality, we want to now add a group open variant. So let's go ahead and just copy this add variant then. It can be part of the same plugin because it's all part of the same or similar functionality. So we can go ahead and create a peer-open variant. So this will create a peer-open class. And we want to merge the already existing group class within Tailwind CSS with a new open class that we're already adding whenever we click the mobile menu icon. So we're already adding that in JavaScript. We're toggling that class name of open. However, now what we want to do is use the sibling selector. So the sibling selector in CSS is the tilde icon. So we can go ahead and use the tilde here. And also, I didn't explain in the last lecture, but I'll also explain in this lecture now what this and is for. So if we go back to our index.html first, and first of all, let's just implement this open and close functionality, and then I'll explain what the ampersand is. So first of all, let's change this. Instead of peer-hover, we want to go peer-open, and we want to display block, but we also want to add a hidden class. So the default is hidden, and then anytime our peer element is open, and actually hovering over this peer.open, I've made a mistake here. It should be in our plugin, it should be peer.open. So let's go ahead and save this first and fix our plugin in the openVariant.js plugin. We want to merge the .peer, not the .group. So because this is targeting the peer now, or any siblings. So we want to make sure we merge the .peer class that already comes out of the box with Tailwind CSS with our new .open class. So now let's take a look in our index.html. This is all looking good. So if we save this now and take a look in the browser, let's give it a refresh, and our mobile menu has hidden because it's hidden by default. Then if we go ahead and click our menu icon to open it, we can see our mobile menu appears. Let's hit the close button and our mobile menu disappears. So now we're toggling our mobile menu. So in the next lecture then, we're going to add our actual menu items for our mobile menu. But first of all, before we finish up this lecture, I want to explain what the ampersand is in our custom variant for our group open and peer open. So if we go back to our index.html where we're actually using these custom variants then, where we've got peer-open, the ampersand is appending our class name in that location when we specify it in the plugin. So for example, because we've added our merge class, we want to merge the peer class and our custom.open class, we've got our tilde in the plugin, and then this is where Tailwind CSS is going to generate this particular class name. So we're going to target this class name wherever our ampersand is. So if we go back to our plugin, and let's just change the ampersand then to the beginning of our class definition. So let's save this in our plugin then. So we've got our ampersand here for the peer variant now. Our ampersand is at the beginning. So let's go ahead and hover over the peer.open or the peer-open variant. So now we can see that the peer-open block is positioned where the ampersand is because that's where we specified it in our plugin. So we can see now our peer-open variant adding the block Tailwind class is now positioned at the beginning of our generated class names here because this is where we added our ampersand. However, we want to add our ampersand at the end. So let's go ahead and change this then. Back in our plugin, we want the ampersand at the end of our class definition. So if we go back to index.html and hover over our peer-open variant, we can now see that whenever our peer class also has an open class, we're targeting any siblings of the .peer.open class names, and we're targeting any siblings that have the .peer-open class and adding the display of block to those siblings. So we're going to finish off our navigation by adding our mobile menu items, and we're also going to be taking a look at our mobile submenu items. Whenever we click on this tickets, we want to display our submenu item for mobile. So to kick this off then, let's go back to our code and let's remove this hard-coded mobile menu label. And first of all, let's go ahead and add our labels in, just like what we did for the desktop version of our menu items. So we'll add a div and a span, and we'll just go home for the first one. We'll go lineup for the second one. The third one is tickets, and we're going to skip past the submenu items for the tickets. For now, we're just going to concentrate on the top level menu items. And then the last label is support. So then we want to go ahead and add some class names to these divs. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to do this by creating multiple cursors. So I'm going to hold down Option on Mac and hold down Alt if you're on Windows to create those multiple cursors, and we want to add some class names. So we've already covered most of the class names already that we're going to add for our mobile menu items. So I'm going to quickly brush through these ones. So we want a position of relative. We want to display flex because we want to centrally align our labels. So it's going to make it easier to centrally align the spans when we display flex on the parent div. We want an H of full, which will give a height of 100%. We want a cursor of pointer, so our users know that they can click on this particular menu item. We want items center and justify center. So both of these classes are going to centrally align vertically and horizontally this span label within this parent div. Then we're going to add a P4 all around, so that will give a padding of 16 pixels all around. We're going to have a font of bold. Again, we want the text pink of 200. And again, we're going to add that hover of text zinc 200, just like what we've done for the desktop menu items. Then we want a transition of colors, and exactly like the desktop items, we want to add that slightly transparent white background cover on hover. So we can go hover bg white /10. So let's save this now and take a look in the browser. If we refresh our project, let's go ahead and open our mobile menu item now. And there we go. We can see our mobile menu items all looking really good. So the last thing we need to do then is hook up the tickets submenu item. And we're going to do this with the group open variant that we created a few lectures ago. So our custom group open variant is again an appropriate variant to use for our tickets submenu item. So let's go back to our code And let's start building out our ticket submenu items then. So for this tickets top level menu item, let's do something a little bit different here and let's wrap it in a div. And we're going to remove the padding for this particular menu item because we're going to add the padding on this div here because we don't want this top level padding to affect our submenu items. So let's go ahead and remove the P4 for the tickets menu item. And what we want to do is add a group to the top level menu item for the tickets. Then for the tickets label then, this is where we're going to add our P4 and we want text center and we're going to add the font bold at this level for the tickets menu. So we want our submenu items to not have a bold text. So you can do that if you want, but I'm just going to show some variation in our design. And it's a little bit more obvious if we take a look at the completed project. It's a little bit more obvious when we open this tickets menu item. If we don't have the bold text for these two submenu items, then it's pretty obvious that these are actually submenu items of the tickets menu item. So that's why I'm removing the font bold on the submenu items and just applying it to the tickets label. So if we go back to our code then, we want to add the font bold to the tickets label and we want to remove it from that top level menu item for our tickets. So as a sibling then to this tickets label, this is going to be our sub menu. So within this div, let's go ahead and add our sub menu items. The first one is going to be a single day ticket. So again, we're going to add a div and within that div, we're going to add a span for the label. So it's going to be single day ticket and let's just copy this and paste it and we want the 7-day ticket for that second submenu item. So I'm going to add all exactly the same classes that I added for the rest of the menu items. So I'm going to quickly brush through this then. We want a position of relative. We want a text pink of 200 and when we hover we want a text zinc of 200 and again when we hover we want that BG white and we're going to use /5 here, so a little bit less of a noticeable white background because it's going to be overlaid anyway on this tickets background. So let's go transition colors and let's go ease in out. So let's take a look in the browser now and see what we've got. So let's refresh and open up our mobile menu and it seems we have a bit of a display issue here, so let's go ahead and fix that then. Back in our code, we want to make sure that we're not actually displaying our tickets menu item as flex. So which means then we need to get rid of the items center and justify center because they no longer apply because we're not displaying this div as flex. Just go ahead and save this and take a look in the browser to see what we've got. Open up the mobile menu again and there we go. We've got our tickets main menu item and we just need to add a couple more styles to the submenu items to finish these off then. So let's go back to our code. And again, for our submenu items, I'm going to add multiple cursors here. I'm going to add a text center and I'm going to add a P4. So let's save this and take a look in the browser now. Again, let's open up our mobile menu and there we go. We can see we've got our submenu items displaying correctly. So the last thing we need to do now then is just hook up the click handler whenever we click the tickets or tap on the tickets because we're going to be on mobile. So whenever we click on the tickets, that's when we want to open or toggle our submenu items for the tickets. So let's go back to our code and we just pretty much want to replicate what we did for our mobile menu icon button. So on our top level menu item here for our tickets, let's go ahead and add an ID. And let's just call it tickets menu item. So then what we can do then is if we scroll right to the top again, let's just copy what we've got for the mobile menu icon. Just copy and paste exactly what we've already got for the mobile menu icon. And now let's just call this tickets menu item. And we want to get element by ID and we want to get the tickets menu item and just replace this mobile menu icon with the tickets menu item because we want to target this tickets menu item now and the functionality is exactly the same. So if our tickets menu item has a class of open, we're just going to remove that class. If it doesn't have that class of open, we're just going to add that class. Just go ahead and save this. And before we take a look in the browser, let's go and hook up the functionality. So for our tickets submenu item, or our submenu item wrapper, I should say, if we scroll, where are the tickets? So we've got the ticket menu item here. So this particular div here is the wrapper for our submenu items. So we want to add a class here, and exactly like what we've done with the group open class before, we want a default state of hidden and we want to add a group open and display block. So if we go ahead and save this and take a look in the browser now, and let's give it a refresh. Let's open up our mobile menu. We can see by default our submenu items for the tickets menu is hidden. But if we click on that tickets menu, well, this is embarrassing. Nothing's actually happening. So let's go back to our code and see where I've gone wrong. So I've got a ticket menu item here. And let's scroll to our script, and I've got the element by ID, but I've referenced the wrong string in here. So I accidentally put tickets menu item, and it should be ticket menu item. So let's go ahead and save this now, and everything should work. So if we take a look in the browser, give it a refresh and open up our mobile menu. Let's click on tickets, and there we go. We can see our tickets submenu items are now visible. And if we click on tickets again, then it hides the submenu. So this concludes our navbar, which means we can now move on to our hero section. We're going to make a start on our hero section. So we're going to start this off by adding our background image to a variable height hero section. So let's go back to our code then, and underneath our navbar, if we scroll all the way down, we want to include our hero section within the header tag because it's part of the header of the page. So within the header tag then, just before we close the header tag, let's go ahead and add a div. So it's within this div that we're going to add our hero section. So we want to make sure that our hero section is display flex, so we can render all this entire section here centrally within the hero section, vertically and horizontally. So it sits nicely in the middle of our hero section. So the first class we want to add then to our hero section is flex. So we're going to display our hero section as flex. Then we want to make sure the flex direction is column. So whereas before we've got the flex direction as row, which is the default flex direction, which means everything will be in a line horizontally. Now we want to make sure that all these items are in a line vertically. So for this, we need to make sure that we add the flex col, which will give the flex direction of column. And we want to make sure we have our items centrally aligned, and we want justify center as well. So again, these two classes will make sure all our items will be sitting in the middle of our hero. Then we want to add a height to our hero. So a lot of heroes, you tend to see that they span the full height of the viewport. However, we're going to do something slightly different here. We're going to make sure that our hero is just under or just slightly less than our viewport so we can see the next section. However, we also need to add a min height because we want to make sure that the hero doesn't shrink too small as to not be able to render this particular content within the hero. So we need to make sure we have a minimum height on our hero, but we also want to make sure that it doesn't grow beyond a certain point as well. So for this, we can go back to our code and add an h dash, and we want to specify a specific value here. So we're not going to lock into the 4 pixel spacing and sizing built into Tailwind. We want to add a specific value here. And the value I'm going to add here is a 100 view height, and I'm going to minus something like 200 pixels from that view height. So to do this, we can use the built-in calc function from CSS, and we just want to go 100 VH for view height minus 200 pixels. Now, if you're already used to using CSS and the calc function, you may be used to using the calc function with 2 different values and a space between if you have a plus or a minus or whatever type of sum you want here. You may be used to having a space. However, in Tailwind CSS, we can't do that. We can't have a space because this means that this is one class, then this will be another class, and then this part will be a third class. So we want to make sure that this is all part of the same class. So there's 2 things we can do here. We can either have no space, and that's absolutely fine. This is going to work. We can see if we hover over this class name that this is going to be the generated styles for this class. However, we can also add underscores instead of spaces. So again, if we hover over, it's going to result in exactly the same output of CSS. However, I much prefer not using the underscores, and I just remove the spaces. So this pretty much all comes down to personal preference. Whichever one you prefer to use is absolutely fine. So I'm going to go ahead and save this now then. And before we take a look in the browser, we need to add a minimum height so it doesn't shrink below a specific height. And also we need to add that background image. So let's go ahead and add a minimum height. We can do that with min-h. And again, I'm going to add a specific value here. So I'm going to add a minimum height of 400 pixels. So the hero can't shrink below this height, the 400 pixel height. And then instead of adding the background image via a class name, which we can do, however, this doesn't work so well for dynamically setting the background image. So we can add the background image via a class. So I'll quickly show you how to do that. We could go BG and then open up a set of square brackets and have URL in here and then the location of our image. So it would be in /assets/ and let's open up the assets folder, images. So we'd go images/hero.jpg, and this would work absolutely fine. And if we hover over, we can see that this is the background image being set here. However, more often than not, you're going to be using Tailwind with things like React and Vue and things like that. And you'll be setting the background image dynamically. So it'd be coming from some sort of CMS perhaps, or a database. So this URL will be dynamic. And in Tailwind CSS, we can't add dynamic values. So for example, if we had in here, we wanted to specify a dynamic URL. So in React, we'd open up a set of curly braces and then we'd render the URL in here. This wouldn't actually work. So Tailwind CSS wouldn't be able to generate this class name correctly because we can't dynamically generate class names in Tailwind CSS. So if you already know the URL beforehand and it's not a dynamic URL, then you can go ahead and add your background image and hard code it as a specific value in here. So just like what we had just now with the specified value of our hero image. So in our example here, this would actually work in our project because we know the URL of our hero image. However, even if I know the URL of the image, I still tend to use the style attribute just because this will also easily translate to using things like dynamic URLs coming from a database or a CMS or something like that. So we're going to add the background image as a style attribute. And again, both ways are absolutely fine. So we're going to add the URL for this background image as a style attribute. So instead of background here, I'm going to go background-image. And then for the URL, I'm going to specify pretty much exactly what I just had for our class name. So I'm going to go assets/images/hero.jpg. So there's a couple more class names we need to add to our hero section. But first of all, I just want to check in the browser and give it a refresh just to make sure that we're rendering everything correctly. And it looks like we are. We've got our hero image rendering correctly for our hero. However, it's not looking great at the moment because it's rendering the full width and height of the image dimensions and it's looking way too big. So we need to make sure that the image fits nicely within our hero section. So we need to add a couple more classes then to our hero div, and we need to add the BG cover class, which will give a background size of cover. So it means that the background will fit nicely in our hero section and the width and height of our hero section. Then we want to centrally align that background image then. So we've got a background position of center with the BG center class. And I'm going to also add a BG of fixed. So the background isn't going to scroll when we scroll down the page. So I'll just demonstrate this now. If we refresh, make sure you save index.html and refresh in the browser. And actually, I'll demonstrate this on the completed project because there's a lot more content there. So when I'm scrolling down on the completed project, you can see that the background image has a fixed position. It's not scrolling down with the content as I'm scrolling down the page. So this is because I've added if we go find that class again, I've added the BG fixed class. So this is the background attachment fixed, which will give that type of effect whenever we scroll down our page. So now that we've got the bare bones for our hero section, we're going to add the content for our hero, starting with our large pink icon. So if we go back to our code then, within our div for our hero, we want to add another div, and it's this div that's going to be responsible for rendering our icon. So this particular section here. So back in our code then, let's go ahead and add some class names first. Let's go ahead and add a BG white, and we want it to be slightly transparent. So it's going to have a transparency of 30%. Then we want padding on the top and bottom of 8 pixels. So we'll add a PY2. Then we want a padding on the left and right of 16 pixels. So we'll add a PX4. Then we'll have a border radius. So we'll have a rounded extra large, which will give a 12 pixel border radius. And we'll add a text center. And lastly, we'll add, if we take a look at the completed project, this cool little frosting effect here. So to do that in Tailwind CSS is really easy. We just need to add the backdrop blur class, and we need to specify how much of a blur we want. So I'm going to add the medium blur. So I'm going to add backdrop blur MD. So let's save this now. And I know we haven't got any content in this div, but because we've got the padding, we should see the type of effect we are hoping to achieve. So let's refresh in the browser. And it's not that obvious actually, because it's very, very small. So we'll add some content, but it's this small section here that we can see, which is that nice frosting effect where we're going to add our logo now. So back in our code then, let's go ahead and fill out the logo section. Let's add the logo within a div, and we'll add a class of relative for this div because we're going to position our little wave animation. So this animation here, this will be position absolute. So we want it to be positioned absolutely in relatively to this particular div. So within this div then, let's add our image. So the source is assets/images/logo.png. And let's go ahead and specify a width for this of 175. So if we save this now and take a look in the browser, let's give it a refresh. And there we go, we can see we've got our pink logo. So before we move on to the animation, let's go ahead and finish off the logo section, adding our logo label and logo text. And then we're going to also add the little form section as well, because that's a nice easy win before moving on to the waveform animation. So let's go ahead and add the logo label then. Back in our code, underneath this div here, let's go ahead and add another div. So this will be the logo label now. And let's add a class of text 5XL because we want some really large text for this. So this will give a 48 pixel font size. And let's add a font of bold. So then let's go ahead and add our TW colon. And then we want to add a span because we want to change the color of the MF label. So let's go class here, and we want this color to be text sky 900. And let's add the MF label in there. So let's save this and take a look in the browser now. Let's give it a refresh. And there we go, we've got our icon label text. So let's go ahead now then and add our form. So back in our code then, underneath our little frosted section for our icon, let's add another div. And this will be the little form label. So this will be keep me updated with news and promotions. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that text there and just paste it within that div. So keep me updated with news and promotions. We'll add a class here, and we'll add a font of bold, a margin top of 12 pixels, so we'll add MT3, and we'll have a text of small. So let's save this now and take a look in the browser. Let's give it a refresh, and there we go, we've got our form label. So let's go ahead and add the actual form then. So again, we need to add another div underneath the form label. And again, for this div, we're going to add the same spacing. So we'll add a margin top of 3 there. We'll add a display of flex because we want our form elements or our input and our submit button to be on the same line horizontally. And then we'll add a gap between those elements of, so this will add an 8 pixel gap. So then the first thing we want to add to the form then is the input, and we'll have a type of email here, a placeholder of email. And if we save this now and take a look in the browser, and hit refresh, we can see that we've got very, very basic styling for our input here. So we want to make sure we add some appropriate styling which matches our project, and we're going to add some nice frosting again to this input, and we're going to change the border color or the outline color whenever we focus in on our input. And as well, I don't know if you can notice here, it's very, very subtle, but the blinking cursor for our input is that nice pink 500 color. So let's go ahead and implement all of those classes then for our input. Let's go ahead and add a class, and we want a rounded border radius of small. We'll add a border and a border white 40. So this will give a slightly transparent white border. We'll add a background white of 30, just like our frosted section for our logo. And then we're going to do exactly the same and add that backdrop blur MD to add the frosting effect. So let's go backdrop, blur, MD. Let's add a padding of 2 all round. So this will give an 8 pixel padding all round. Let's have a font bold and a text sky 900. And let's add a placeholder zinc 500. So this will be the text color for the placeholder text. And let's add a carrot pink of 500. So this is the very subtle blinking cursor within the input that I mentioned. So this is a pink of 500, that carrot there. In Tailwind, they call it a carrot. I call it a cursor, but in Tailwind, they call it a carrot. So let's go ahead and also add an outline pink of 500. So this outline pink of 500 will only display whenever we focus in on the input. So let's go ahead and save this now and take a look in the browser just to see what we've got. Let's give it a refresh. And there we go. We can see we've got our input here with our pink outline. We have our slight border radius. We have our nice frosted background effect. And if we type in here, we can see we've got the pink caret or the cursor, and we have our text color of sky 900. So the last thing we need to do now then is add our submit button. So back in our code, let's go ahead and after this input, let's go ahead and add a div. And within this div, let's add the label of subscribe. So let's add some class names then to make this div look more like a button. So first of all, let's add a cursor pointer so our users know that they can actually click on this button. Let's add a rounded small. We want a BG pink of 500. Let's give it a padding on the y-axis, so the top and bottom of 2, and a padding on the left and right, so the x-axis of 4. Let's add a font bold. Let's add a transition colors. So whenever we hover over this, we're going to change the background color. So we'll have that nice transition between our background colors. So let's add that background color then on hover. So let's go hover, BG sky 900, and let's also add hover shadow large, so it looks like it's sort of coming off the page a little bit anytime we hover over the button. So let's save this and take a look in the browser and see what we've got. Let's give it a refresh, and there we go. We can see we have our nice subscribe button. We're going to implement our little waveform animation. So first of all, let's go ahead and add all the appropriate divs that we're going to need that will represent each of our bars for our waveform. So back in our code then, we want to add this just underneath our image. So underneath our pink logo, because we're going to overlay this animation over the pink logo. So where we've already got this static waveform here, we're going to create our own pink colored circle and overlay it over the existing static waveform. So back in our code then, underneath the image, let's go ahead and add a div. And within this div then, we're going to add another div. So this is going to be the wrapper div, and we're going to add some appropriate classes to this wrapper div. And this div is going to wrap our bars. So it's within this div that we're going to have our bars. So first of all, let's just go ahead and add those bars. So we want 5 bars in total. So let's add 5 divs. So let's add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 divs there. And each of these divs are going to have a different height, because we want the bars to go from a small height and gradually get bigger to the middle bar, which will be the greatest height, and then again decrease in size to the last bar, which will be the same height as the first bar. So for this, let's go back to our code, and for the first div, let's add an h of 2 and a width of 1. So our width of all these bars will be 4 pixels, so that's going to be standard across all of our bars. So the first bar though is going to have a height of 8 pixels. So let's go ahead and add the same for that last bar. So it'll have a height of 8 pixels. So we'll add H2 there and W1 for width 1. And then for the 3 remaining bars, let's go ahead and add those widths first, because it's going to be a lot easier with the multiple cursor. So let's go width 1 for all of those bars. But we want to add different heights for each of these bars now. So the second bar will be an H3. The third bar will be an H4. The fourth bar will be an H3 again, because we're going down in size from this middle bar. So this middle bar will always be the tallest bar, and it will increase from the first bar to the tallest bar and then decrease down to the last bar. So again, just so we have a bit of variation between all of our bars, if we take a look at the completed project, the first and last bars are slightly washed out in color compared to these middle bars. So we're going to have a little bit of a gradient type of effect across all of these bars. So we can achieve this across all the bars by adding a BG pink 300 to the first bar and the last bar. So let's add BG pink 300 for that last bar. Then the second and fourth bars. So it'd be easier if we add multiple cursors for this. So the second and fourth bars then, we want a BG pink of 200. And then the middle bar, we want a BG pink of 100. So if we save this and take a look in the browser now, let's refresh our project, and we can see our bars here. However, they're not displaying correctly. So let's go ahead and fix this then. So back in our code, for this very top level div, let's go ahead and add a class of flex, and we want our items center and justify center. So then this is our positioning div. And within this positioning div, we want to add our own pink circle. Like if we take a look at our project here, we want to mimic this pink circle and overlay it over the pink circle for the icon. So just like what we've got in the completed project, we want to recreate this pink circle. So this div here will be the pink circle, the parent div to the bars, and the child div to the wrapper. So let's add a class here as well, and we want a BG pink of 500. We want a width of 14. which will give a width of 56 pixels and a height of 14. Exactly the same thing. It will give a height of 56 pixels. Then we want a rounded of full, which will make this div appear as a circle. And again, we're going to make sure that this div displays flex because we want our bars to display vertically and horizontally, to display right in the middle of our pink circle, and we want them to display centrally, vertically and horizontally. So again, we're going to add the item center and the justify center classes. So now let's take a look in the browser just to see what we've got. Let's give it a refresh. And there we go. We're nearly there, actually. We just need to make sure we position our circle over the existing pink circle for our logo. And we need to make sure we add some rounded borders for our bars and some spacing for our bars as well. So back in our code, let's go ahead and add that spacing first for our bars. So let's give a gap of 1, which will give a gap of 4 pixels between each of our bars. And for each of our bars then, let's go ahead and create multiple cursors. And we want to create a rounded full, which will give a nice rounded effect on the top and bottom of each of our bars. So again, let's take a look in the browser and give it a refresh. And there we go. We've got our waveforms all looking correctly now. The last thing we need to do before we go onto the animation is position this circle above the circle in our logo. So again, let's go back to the code and let's manipulate the positioning of this top level div. Let's go ahead and give it a margin top. And we're going to specify a specific value here, and we're going to have minus 70 pixels. I just happen to know that minus 70 pixels is exactly the margin top that we need to make sure that this circle overlays the circle in the logo. So if we give this a refresh, we can see that our circle now, that the one we've just created, overlays nicely the circle in our logo. So then we also want to add some margin bottom. So there's a bit of spacing between our logo and our logo label. So back in our code, let's add an MB for margin bottom, and let's add a margin bottom of 5. So I'll give a margin bottom of 20 pixels. So let's save this and take a look in the browser now. Let's give it a refresh. And there we go. So we're in a position now to work on our animation. So to make this animation possible then, what we want to do is expand and contract the heights of each of these bars. But we also want to make sure that they expand and contract at different times. Because if they all went up and down or expanded and contracted at the same time, that would look a little bit weird. But we are actually going to implement that first. So I'll show you what I mean by it looking a little bit weird, because we'll be able to see it as we're coding it out. So let's go ahead and start working on the animation then. We actually want to create our own custom animation for this. So we're going to extend the Tailwind CSS theme. So to do that, we can go to our tailwind config.js, and within our theme object, we can add an extend property. And within this extend property, we can extend all of our Tailwind CSS default values and add to those default values. For example, if we wanted to add to the BG dash class, we could do this within this theme extend. However, we want to add an animation class. So first of all, we need to create the keyframes for our animation. And then we need to give our keyframes a name. So I'm going to call it wavy because it's a type of wavy animation. And then we want to specify 2 values here. So from 0% to 100%, we want to make sure that we add the CSS property transform. And we want to transform each of our bars by scaling them to half their size. And then when the keyframes are at 50%, we want to make sure that we transform our bars to 1.5 their original size. So for this, we can easily use the scale Y transform and pass in 0.5 here. So this will make sure that we decrease our height for each of our bars by half. And then at 50% of the animation, we want to do exactly the same thing, but we want to transform and scale Y 1.5. So this will make sure we increase our heights by half. So at 0%, we're going to start off our animations for each of our bars at half their original height. And then when we hit 50%, it will go to 1.5 times their height. And then back at 100%, it will go to 0.5 times their height. And then what we're going to do is loop over. So the animation is a continuous expanding and contracting of each of those bars. So then underneath these keyframes, we want to go ahead and add an animation, and we're going to call this animation wavy. So what Tailwind CSS will do is, because we've extended the theme now, Tailwind CSS is going to go ahead and create a new class name, and it's going to look something like this. We're now going to have access to animation-wavy because we've specified animation here. We want to extend the Tailwind CSS theme adding an animation property, and Tailwind CSS is going to concatenate these two. We've created our custom wavy animation, so it's going to concatenate those two as a class name, and we're going to reference this wavy keyframes within our wavy animation now. So we want to set this to a string, and we want to specify wavy here. So this particular wavy reference here is referencing the wavy keyframes. Then we need to specify how long the animation will last. So we can put 1 second in here or 1000 milliseconds. Both of those values are exactly the same. And I want it to be a linear animation, and we want to specify infinite here. So it's going to continue looping over these keyframes infinitely. So if we save this, then I'm going to remove this comment here. So if we save this and then go back to our index.html for each of our bars, then let's type animation now, and we can see down here we have animate wavy. So this is the custom animation that we've just created now, and we can see we have a wavy keyframes here. At 0, it's going to start at 0.5 height, 50% it's going to go 1.5 times height, and 100% back to 0.5, and we can see that it's going to go on infinitely. So let's go ahead and specify the animate wavy, and actually we want it to apply to each of our bars. So let's go ahead and create multiple cursors here, and I'm going to add animate wavy for each of our bars. So let's save this and take a look in the browser now. Let's give it a refresh, and there we go. We can see that our bars are animating correctly. We're contracting and expanding. However, we need to add some delay to some of these bars, so they're not all expanding and contracting at the same time. We need some sort of variation so it actually looks a bit more like a waveform. So this is where we're going to create our own custom plugin, because animation delay doesn't exist out of the box with Tailwind CSS. So it's something we're going to have to create ourselves. And this is a really good opportunity to show off a different method to create a Tailwind CSS plugin. Let's go ahead and create our own custom animation delay plugin. So if we go back to our code, within our plugins directory, let's go ahead and create a new file, and we're going to call it animationdelay.js. And just like with the open variant, we want to import the plugin function from Tailwind CSS/plugin. So in animation delay, then let's go ahead and create a const plugin and set this equal to require Tailwind CSS/plugin. Then let's go ahead and create that animation delay plugin. Then let's go const animation delay and set this equal to plugin, and pass a function as a callback function to the plugin. And this plugin is going to be different in the way we create it, because we're going to make sure that this is a dynamic class, which means if we go back to our index.html, ideally what we want to do is specify an animation delay, and we can create some default class names for this. So for example, just like what we've done for things like margin, top, to, and all the already specified and out of the box values with Tailwind, we can also add a specific value with the square brackets. So ideally we want to do exactly the same with the animation delay. So what we want to do is be able to use something like animation delay and then 100 for 100 milliseconds, 200 for 200 milliseconds, etc., etc. But then also allow dynamic values. So for example, open up some square brackets and add 150 milliseconds. So this is also possible with Tailwind CSS plugins, and specifically it's possible, if we go back to our animation delay, it's possible to create this with the match utilities helper. So let's go ahead and destructure the match utilities from the callback to plugin, and let's go ahead and use this match utilities then. And the match utilities will take an object, and what we want to do is specify the base class name that we want to use for this particular utility class. So here we want to specify animation-delay, and this is going to be a function. So we want to set this to a function because it can take a dynamic value. So the dynamic value will be passed to the function anytime we call our animation delay like this with the square brackets and passing in a specific value. So that value will be accessible from this function. And then what we want to do is just return an object with a CSS class. So we want to return an animation delay. And for this, we need to use camel case. So Tailwind expects that we're going to use camel case for the CSS properties when we return it from the match utilities. So we just want to set that equal to the value that we pass whenever we specify it in the square brackets here. So this will set up our animation delay as a dynamic utility where we can specify it in square brackets, but we also want to make sure that we provide some defaults as part of this plugin. Now, we're not actually going to use all of these defaults, but I just want to show you how to add these defaults for these utility classes. So this is a dynamic utility class, and now let's go ahead and add some default classes for our animation delay. So for this, we need to destructure theme as well from our callback function. And as the second argument to the plugin function, we can override or extend the Tailwind CSS theme. So we can add a theme property here and add an animation delay property. And then within this animation delay, this is where we can specify all of our default utility classes for our animation delay. So I'm just going to add 100 to 900 here. And as we increment, we're just going to specify that animation delay 100 will be 100 milliseconds. Animation delay 200 will be 200 milliseconds, etc., etc. So instead of you watching me typing all this out now, I'm just going to quickly add it all in and then return to the video. So there we go. I've added all my default classes in, and I've actually added 1000 as well for 1000 milliseconds. So again, we're not going to use all of these default classes, but I just want to show you how to add these default classes in whenever we're creating these dynamic utility classes. So the last thing we need to do now then is register these default values as part of our animation delay utility class. So we can specify as well as a second argument to the match utilities. We can specify default values to register for this animation delay class. So we can specify values here, and we can go ahead and grab all of these animation delay values that we've just created by using the theme function and referencing the animation delay values. So this theme function here with the animation delay string here is referencing these animation delay values that we've just created. And it's going to add it to our utility function and create all of those animation delay classes, as well as allow us to create dynamic values via those square brackets. So let's go ahead then and finish off this plugin. We want to go module.exports and set that equal to animation delay. So let's save this now then, and we want to reference our new animation delay plugin in our tailwind config.js. So in the plugins then, let's go ahead and require /plugins/animation delay. And then if we take a look in our index.html then, let's remove this animation delay here. Let's save this and let's start typing then animation delay, and we can already see it down here. These are now our new animation delay classes. So we've got 100 to 1000, but we can also specify, if we wanted to, an animation dash delay dash and then any value that we want in here. So let's, for example, go 150 milliseconds. Let's hover over this class, and now we can see that this animation delay class is going to generate the animation delay of 150 milliseconds in our CSS. So we don't actually want an animation delay for that first bar, but let's go ahead and add it for the second bar. So let's go animation delay 200 for the second bar. Let's go ahead and add an animation delay of 150 milliseconds for the third bar. We can add an animation delay of 300 for the fourth bar. And for the fifth bar, let's just go ahead and add another dynamic one. So let's go animation delay and specify 75 milliseconds. So let's save this now and take a look in the browser. Let's give it a refresh. And there we go. We can see our bars are now staggered when they start their animations. So it looks a little bit more like a waveform. So now that we've concluded our hero section, in the next section and the next lecture, we're going to take a look at adding our main body content and creating our headliners slideshow, as well as our toggle for our light and dark mode. We're going to build out our headliners section. So first of all, let's add our headliners text. So we'll have a paragraph text and some sort of heading element as well. So let's go ahead and start building that out then back in our code. If we scroll all the way down underneath our header section then, let's go ahead and add a new div. And we want to centrally align this div on the screen. So we can see we have a max width for all of our remaining content after our header section. So we want to have a max width and we want to make sure we centrally align our content. So to do that, let's go back to our code and let's add a class to this div. And we want to add a max width. So we can do that with max W, and we can go screen large. So this will give a max width of 1024 pixels. then all we need to do is give a margin on the left and right of auto. So then let's also give a margin top of 20, just so we've got some noticeable spacing between our header and our content. So then let's go ahead and add an H2 here. And within the H2, this is going to be our heading, obviously. So we're going to add headliners in for that H2. Then for the paragraph tag, I'm just going to copy it from the completed project, our paragraph text. So I'm going to paste it in for that paragraph tag, and let's save this now and take a look in our project. Let's give it a refresh in the browser, and we can see that our headliners, even though it's an H2, the text size is exactly the same as our paragraph text. Now, I did briefly mention this at the start of the course, and this is because Tailwind CSS has a bunch of reset CSS for us. So it makes sure that every single element is not being influenced by any browser styling. So it's going to be consistent across every single browser. But that also means we need to make sure we add these styles back in for each of our headings, because we want to make sure each of our headings from H1 to H6 has a different font size compared to the rest of our text within our site. So to do that, we could easily add, if we go back to our code, we could easily add for our H2, we could add some class names and add a text of, for example, 5XL. So this will give a font size of 48 pixels. However, if we have a bunch of H tags and heading tags on our site, and we have to add all these different font sizes for each of our heading tags throughout our site manually, then it's going to be a massive pain. It would be so much more efficient if we could just specify in one place a consistent font size for all of our headings. So for example, our H1 tags might have a text of 6XL, our H2 a text of 5XL, H3 a text of 4XL, etc, etc. So instead of having to remember that our H1s are going to have a text of 6XL and then having to specify it for every single heading 1 tag, it's going to be so much more efficient if we specify all of this in one place. So let's get rid of this class name then, and let's head back to our input.css. And for our base layer, this is the perfect place to add our default styles for our heading tags. So we've already got our default style for our HTML tag, where we're specifying the font family as our custom Google font. So this is also the perfect place to add our styles for our heading tags. So for our H1 tag, I'm going to go ahead and apply a text 6XL, and I'm going to go down for each of our heading classes then. So we've got H1 here, we want H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. So let's go ahead and update these then. So H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. So then H1 is 6XL. So let's decrease these sizes then. So let's go down to 5XL, 4XL, 3, 2, and then we just have text XL for the H6. So let's save this now and take a look in the browser. Let's give it a refresh, and there we go. Our headliners has a nice large text size for that H2. And I'm also going to go ahead and apply for each of these heading tags. I want to make sure that they have a bold font. So I'm going to create a multiple cursor here, and I'm just going to add as well font bold. So let's save this and take a look at the browser now. Let's give it a refresh, and there we go. We're not explicitly specifying class names for the styling and the font size for our headers now, because these are all specified in our base layer within Tailwind CSS. We're going to make a start on our carousel for our headliners. So let's quickly demo this then. If I scroll across in my headliners and make sure that I'm scrolled in between two different headliners, if I let go of the scroll, we can see it snaps into place. So it's a little bit difficult to actually demo this and show what I mean without you actually experiencing it yourself. So essentially, all that's happening is we're making sure that each of our headliners will snap to the center of our carousel. So we'll have one headliner in the center of our carousel unless we're right at the start or right at the end of the carousel. So if I try and bring this gap here right into the center of our carousel, it's going to spring back and snap to the nearest headliner. So I'm going to demonstrate this again then. If I scroll and bring that gap right to the center of the carousel and I let go, then it's going to snap to the nearest headliner card. So let's go ahead and start working on this then. Back in our code, within our index.html, Underneath our paragraph tag, let's add a div and let's give it a margin top of 4. We want it to display flex because we want our carousel items all in a row. We want width to be full, so this will give a 100% width. We want a gap of 4 in between each of our headliner cards, so we'll have a 16 pixel gap between our headliners. Let's give a padding bottom of 5 just so we got a bit of spacing on the bottom, and this will also mean that we have some spacing to allow for our scroll bar. So if I'm scrolling here, we can see we've got a scroll bar. If we didn't have that padding bottom, then the scroll bar will be overlaying this description text for our headliners. So we don't want that. So that's why we're adding some padding bottom to our carousel. Then to add that snap effect, then literally all we need to do is add a snap X. So on the X axis, we want to add a scroll snap, and we need to make sure that we add an overflow. So we also want an overflow X of auto. So this means this section is scrollable for our headliner items, and we're adding this scroll snap as well with the snap X. So let's go ahead and add our items then. So let's add these in as divs. So the first item then, we want to make sure we add a specific width to each of our items. So I'm going to add a min width here and add a specific value with the square brackets. And I'm going to add 80% in here. So this will be the mobile width. If we take a look at the completed project, if we reduce the screen size, we want each of these card items on a mobile width to be 80% of the container. And then when we bring the screen size up to a tablet width and above, we want the width to be 40% for each of our cards. So back in our code then, let's go ahead and add that. So we've got our minimum width of 80% for mobile. Then let's go MD : to target tablets and above. And then we want to add a min width here of 40%. So then within this card wrapper then, let's go ahead and add a div, and it's this div that will be responsible for displaying our band image. So let's go class here, and we're going to set this as a background image to this div. So let's add a height. So we'll have a height of 80, which will be 320 pixels. Let's add a 100% width with W full. We need to add a snap center. So this means just like what I demonstrated now, the scroll snap will be centrally aligned and snap to the center of each of our headliner cards. Let's give a rounded XL to give a nice border radius for our images. We want a BG cover, a BG center to centrally align that background image. And let's add a shadow of MD so it's got a nice shadow around the background image. And for the shadow to work then, we also need to specify a shadow color. So I'm going to specify a shadow black, and I want it to be a slightly transparent black. So I'm going to have 20% transparency for the shadow black. Just like what we've done before with the background colors, we can specify a color and then slash, and then the amount of transparency that we want for that color. Then all we need to do is add this background image then. So let's add a style attribute here, and let's go background-image and URL here. So the URL will be in assets/images/band1.jpg. So let's save this now and take a look in the browser, and let's give it a refresh and see what we've got. So we've got our first band name here, Corduroy Gary. And then all we need to do is add the details for Corduroy Gary. So we need to add his name and the date and time that he's playing, as well as the stage. So let's go ahead and do that then. I'm going to add these as heading tags. So it may look a little bit different to the completed project we've just seen, but I want to add these in as heading tags just to show you and demonstrate the different font sizes for our heading tags. So I'm going to add an H5 here, and I'm going to have Corduroy Gary, and I'm just going to add a class for this H5. I'm just going to add a margin top of 2, just so there's a bit of spacing between our background image and our band name. And then I'm going to add an H6, and this will be 1st of July, 9 p.m. on the main stage. And actually I've added an H5 again. I need to add an H6 here. So H6 for our details and H5 for our band name. So let's go back to our code and give this a refresh and see what we've got now. So we've got Corduroy Gary, and we can see our different font sizes. And note as well, I haven't changed any text colors yet because that's going to be part of the light and dark theme. So we'll take a look at that in the next lecture at changing the font colors. However, for now, this is looking really good, and all we need to do is add our remaining items. So I'm going to go ahead and add the remaining items for our bands. So we have in total, we have 7 bands. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste all of these, and I'm not going to go ahead and update the band name and the band details and the time, etc. I'm just going to go ahead and update each of the images. So it's going to be band 1, band 2, band 3, etc., etc. .jpg. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And again, I'm not going to let you watch me adding all of these in. So go ahead and pause the video here while you add these in as well and restart the video after you've added them in. So I'm just going to go ahead and do the second one as part of the video. Then I'm going to add them in and return to the video. So there we go. I've added band 2 here. So let's go ahead and save it and take a look in the browser. Let's give it a refresh. And there we go. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and add all of the rest of them in and then return to the video. Okay, so I've added all my bands in now. I've got band 1 to band 7 within my carousel. So let's go back to the browser and give it a refresh. And let's try and scroll now. So I'm going to bring the gap to the middle of the carousel again between the guy holding the trumpet and the guys wearing the golden blazers. So I'm going to let go of the scroll and there we go. It snaps to the trumpet guy because he's the nearest one. And if I try and bring it again, it always snaps to the center of a particular card. So then if we reduce the screen size and make sure this still works on a smaller screen size, we can see we've got our 80% width now. And again, if we try and bring the gap to the middle of the carousel and let go of our scroll, then it snaps back to the center of each of our cards. We're going to take a look at light and dark mode within our website. And there's 2 different ways we can do this. So we can do it toggling it manually via a button. So just like we can see in the completed project with this small button on the side toggling between light and dark mode, but we can also do it by basing it off the user's preference of their local machine. So as you can probably tell, my Mac is set to dark mode. So we're going to be basing our styles first of all off the local machine. So if I bring up the display settings for my Mac, we can see we've got a light and dark mode that we can toggle between. So when I go to light mode, it updates my browser and all my apps and things like that. However, I much prefer dark mode, but we are first of all going to implement our light and dark mode based on the user's preference for their local machine. So if we go back to our code then, this type of functionality comes out of the box with Tailwind CSS. So we don't need to set up any configuration or anything like that to be able to toggle between light and dark mode just based off the user's preference on their local machine. So to prove this, I'm going to scroll to the top of my main content here, just underneath our header where we've got our headliners. And I'm going to add a text zinc of 900. I'm going to save this and take a look in the browser now and give it a refresh, and not much is actually changed. So what happens now then, if I go back to my code, and for this div, I can target the dark variant, and just like what we've used before with all of our other variants, with the group variant, the peer variant, the hover variant, we can also use a dark variant followed by any valid Tailwind CSS class. So when we're in dark mode then, we want our text to be zinc 200. And let's go ahead and also add a background color. But let's go ahead and add the background color right at the top of our markup then. Right at the top, let's go to the main tag and let's add the background color to the main tag. So let's add a class to the main tag then, and let's give a default background color of zinc 200. So let's go BG zinc 200. And then when we're in dark mode, let's give a BG zinc 900. So let's save this now and take a look in the browser. Let's give it a refresh and we can see that my background color changed as well as my text color for my main content. So if I go back to my settings then and I toggle between my light and dark mode, we can see now that my background in my site is changing in real time based on whichever mode I select for my local machine. So it's really that easy to be able to add light and dark mode to our Tailwind CSS sites. We just need to use the dark variant followed by any valid Tailwind CSS class. However, what if we want to allow the user to change this manually via a button, just like what I demonstrated in the completed project with this toggle? So we're going to continue implementing our light and dark mode, but we're going to change it up now and we're going to implement our light and dark mode based on a manual toggle that the user can click on in our site. So first of all, let's go ahead and create this button. So let's go back to our code and right at the top of our header, just above our navbar, let's go ahead and add our toggle button for our light and dark mode. So we'll add a div here and we're going to give this div an ID because we need to register our clicks whenever we click on this button. And let's call it dark mode toggle. Then let's add a bunch of class names then to this button. We want to position fixed, so it's in exactly the same place in our screen, no matter if we're scrolling up and down our site. We want a top of 24, so this will just give a top of 96 pixels, a right of 0, so it's right flush against the right hand side of our screen. Let's give it an inline block, a width of 12, a cursor pointer, and let's go ahead and add some nice rounded corners, but just to the left hand side. So for that we can use the rounded L. So this will target the border top left radius and border bottom left radius. And we want a large size for our border radius. Then let's add a BG zinc of 900. So this will be the background for our light mode. So for our dark mode then, let's add a BG zinc of 200. And for our light mode, we want a text zinc of 200, but for our dark mode, we want a text zinc of 900. So then let's add a padding of 2 all round, so it'll give a padding of 8 pixels. Then let's have something like a text 3XL, so our icons, our sun and our moon icon are big enough to click on. So then let's save this. And before we take a look in the browser, we need to actually add our icons. So I'm using Font Awesome for this, and I've already included it as part of the starter repo for this course. I'm just importing or referencing the Font Awesome scripts at the top of our head tag. So I've already included it as part of the starter repo to this course, so you don't need to do anything to make this work. So I'm going to go ahead and add an I tag for our first icon then, and the first icon will be FA solid FA-sun, and in dark mode we want to make sure that this is hidden. So we only want to display one icon at a time, obviously. So in dark mode we're going to display the moon, and in light mode we'll be going to display the sun. So let's go ahead and add the moon class then, or the moon icon. Let's go FA solid again. We want FA moon, and it's hidden as default, but in dark mode, we want to display inline. And let's take a look in the browser just to see what we've got. Our functionality won't work just yet, but let's just see what we've got in the browser. Let's give it a refresh, and we can see in dark mode, we're displaying our moon and our sun is hidden. So if I go ahead and open up my settings then and manually change the light and dark mode in my settings just to see this moon icon disappear and the sun icon appear whenever we change between light and dark mode. So let's change between light and dark mode then. There we go. We can see our sun now appears, and go back to dark mode and our moon appears. So we want to make sure that this functionality is available whenever we actually click on this button rather than relying on the user's preference on their local machine. So back in our code then, let's scroll up to our script tag and let's go ahead and just copy what we've got for our tickets menu item, because the functionality is going to be pretty much exactly the same. So let's rename this to dark mode toggle, and we want to get element by ID, and we want to get our ID called dark mode toggle. So let's go dark mode toggle in there. Then we want to add the event listener, the click event listener to the dark mode toggle. But instead of adding the class list to the dark mode toggle, we want to just add it to the body tag. So we can go document.body.classlist.contains dark. So we need to make sure that we add a dark mode class, which is built in to Tailwind CSS. So before I demonstrate the clicking on the toggle button, I'll demonstrate the dark mode class. But first of all, let's just code this up. So we want to replace this then with document.body.classlist, and we want to remove dark, and then document.body.classlist again to add that dark class. So whenever we click on our button then, we're going to check to see if our body class list contains the class dark. If it does, it means we're already in dark mode, so we'll remove that dark class, which essentially changes us to light mode. However, if our body class doesn't contain the dark class, it means we're in light mode, so we want to add the dark class, meaning we change to dark mode. So to get all this working then, before I demonstrate this, we need to add one small configuration in our tailwind config.js. And right at the top here, we need to add dark mode and set this to class. So this means the dark mode is going to be driven via a dark class name rather than the default of the user's local machine. So to demonstrate this, let's go back to the browser, let's give it a refresh, and we're no longer running the dark mode off of our local machine settings because we can see the background here is now white and my machine is in dark mode. However, if I manually add a class to our body, if we go back to index.html, let's add a class here to body, and let's just add the dark class to body. And if I go back to the browser now and give it a refresh, we can see that we're in dark mode. So it's all we need to do to manually do this then within light and dark mode via a toggle button is we just need to toggle a class of dark anytime or anywhere we want to use our light and dark mode. So I'm going to keep the class dark on my body because I want dark mode to be set as default. So then if I go back to my browser now and I click on my light and dark mode toggle, we can see we're toggling between light and dark mode. So before we move on to the next lecture, I want to quickly fix this issue of our hero content overwriting or overlapping our navbar. So to do this, we just need to add a Z index to our navbar. And if we go to our nav then, in our code, let's add a Z10, which will give a Z index of 10. Let's save this and take a look in the browser now. Let's give it a refresh, and there we go. Our navbar is now sitting nicely on top of our hero content. So in the next lecture then, we're going to skip past our lineup timeline because I want to move on to the tickets table, because it's in this tickets table that we're going to create another Tailwind CSS plugin. And it's going to be a different plugin to all the other ones we've created before. So then after this tickets table and creating the plugin for this tickets table, then we'll move on to the lineup timeline. We're going to create the tickets table, and we're also going to create another custom plugin, and it's going to be slightly different because we're going to be using a different helper function from Tailwind CSS plugin to create a class that we haven't created before. So whereas before we've created our variant classes, we've created our dynamic utility classes, so now we're actually going to create a static utility class. So first of all, let's create the table and then we'll create the plugin. So back in our code then, right at the bottom, right underneath our content, we want to add our tickets table. So within the last closing div then, because this is actually our wrapper for our content, let's add an H2 in here and let's just put tickets. So let's add a class here to separate the content from the tickets, and the main content, we want to add a margin top of 20. Then underneath the H2, let's add a table. So again, let's go ahead and add some margin top to this table. So let's add a margin top of 5. Just so there's a bit of spacing between our header and our table content. And we want to add the table class from Tailwind CSS. So this is going to display as table. We want the width to be 100%. So we'll add W full. We want a border and a border color of zinc 500. And we want to add a border collapse. So this means it's not going to double up on borders. For example, each cell in our table, if the cell has a border and it's touching another cell with a border, it's just going to collapse those borders, so it just looks like one border separating those cells instead of two borders separating those cells. So let's go ahead and add our table data then. Let's add a table head, and for our table head, let's have a slightly larger font size. So let's go text large and font bold. Then let's add our TD, and the first one will be tickets, and then the second will be the price. So just like our completed project, we have our tickets and our price. So let's go ahead and add a border to each of these cells then. Let's add a class and have border and border zinc 500. And let's add a padding of 3 all round. So then let's add our table data underneath our table header. Let's go tbody, and the first row will be the single day ticket. So let's add a table row here, and within the table row, let's add some table data. And the first one will be the type of ticket. So it's going to be single day ticket. And then the next cell will be the price. So this will be, let's just put something like 30 quid in there. Then let's add another table row. And then this one will be the 7-day ticket. And again, let's add another cell here with the price. And let's just put 100 quid for the price of the 7-day ticket. So again, let's add some classes to each of our cells then. Let's go ahead and create multiple cursors for each of our cells and add a class. And again, we want a border and a border zinc of 500. And let's add a padding top and bottom of 2 and a padding left and right of 3. So let's save this now and take a look in the browser, and let's give it a refresh. And let's scroll down and we can see we've got our tickets table here. So the last thing we need to do now is add our caption. So once they're gone, they're gone. So let's go back to our code and let's add the caption right underneath our table body because that's where we want it positioned. So let's add a caption here and let's go once they're gone, they're gone. So let's save this now and take a look in the browser. Let's give it a refresh, and we can see even though we added our caption underneath our table body, it's actually displaying right at the top here. And that is because by default, captions in tables display at the top of the table. But we can in CSS display our captions underneath our table. However, this doesn't come out of the box with Tailwind CSS. So again, this is a perfect situation for us to create our own custom utility function. So let's go back to our code then. And in our plugins, let's create a new file called tablecaption.js. And again, let's import plugin from our Tailwind CSS / plugin. And we want to create a const table caption and set that equal to plugin. And again, we're going to specify a callback function in this plugin then. And then we want to do module.exports and set that equal to table caption. So within this callback function then, let's go ahead and now use the add utilities function. So we've not used this add utilities function before. We've only ever used the match utilities. So match utilities allows us to create dynamic classes. However, the add utilities allows us to create static classes. So we just need a static class for this table caption because we're not going to specify different units and values like we did with the animation delay, because we just need to create one class really called caption bottom, and it's going to position that caption at the bottom of the table. So the add utilities function is really easy to use. We just call it add utilities function and pass an object, and each key in this object then is going to be the class that we want to create. So I want to create a .caption bottom class. And this will be an object, and we just want to specify in here the appropriate CSS that we want to target. So we want to target the caption-side CSS property, and this is actually a valid CSS property. It's not a very well-known one, but it is a valid CSS property. So we want to target the caption side, and we want to add an appropriate value for this caption side. And obviously we can only use valid CSS values for this caption side, and one of them is bottom. So it's just positioning the caption at the bottom of the table. Now we also can specify top for caption side. However, this is the default, so we don't actually need to create a caption top class, but for the sake of completeness, let's go ahead and do that for our plugin. Let's add a caption top, and again, we want to target the caption side and specify top as the value. So let's go ahead and use this table caption then. Within our tailwind config.js, we want to require it in our plugins array. So let's require here plugins/table caption. Let's save this, and in our index.html now, for our caption, let's add a class and let's go caption. And now we can see we have a caption top and a caption bottom. So let's go ahead and use the caption bottom class. Let's save this and now take a look in the browser. Let's give it a refresh. And there we go. Our caption is now at the bottom of our table. We're going to build out our lineup section. So let's go back to our code then. And in our index.html, we want to add this section above our ticket section. So again, let's add another h2 class here, and this will have the label of lineup. And again, we're just going to add some spacing to the top. So let's add an MT20, and underneath here, let's add a paragraph tag. And I'm just going to copy the paragraph text from the completed project. So follow the timetable and stage to ensure you don't miss your favorite artists. I'm just going to paste that in there for my paragraph tag. And then underneath this paragraph tag is where we're going to create our timeline. So this timeline is going to be laid out using grid. So we've already taken a look at using Flexbox with Tailwind in this course. And now we're going to take a look at using CSS grid. So first of all, let's create a wrapper div, and this wrapper div is just going to have a dark colored background and a little bit of padding. Just go ahead and add some classes then. And just for reference, we're trying to emulate this particular section here with the dark background. So let's add that dark background then. But first of all, let's add a margin top of 5 just so we've got a bit more spacing between our paragraph tag. Then let's add a background zinc of 800, a padding on the top and bottom of 4, and a padding on the left and right of 2. And let's add a text zinc of 200. So we also want to make sure that this is a position relative, because we're going to have an absolutely positioned element within this div. And if we take a look at the completed project, this line here, this blue, dark blue line going all the way from the top of the timeline to the bottom of the timeline, this is going to display absolute. So we need to make sure that this is position relative, so we can position our absolute div relative to our parent div. So let's go ahead and first of all create that dark blue timeline line. So let's go back to our code then and create that div. Let's add a class and we want to position absolute. We want the top to be 0. We want a 50% left. So for this, we can go left dash 1/2, which stands for half, which is 50%. So whereas before we've only ever looked at values in pixels. So where we've added left 1, left 2, exactly the same with margin top, for example, MT20. These are all pixel values and REM values. However, we can also add percentages which come out of the box with Tailwind. So as well as half, we could add a quarter. Let's hover over this and we can see this is 25%. However, we want the 50%, so we'll use left half. And let's go ahead and add a width of 4. So we have a 16 pixel width for our timeline line, but because this is left 50%, it's going to be over to the right-hand side by 8 pixels too much. So we need to make sure we offset this by 8 pixels to the left. So for this, we can use margin left and use -8 pixels in here. And just as a side note here, as well as specifying a negative value for our margin left in this way, and it goes with any other class name that we want to add a specific value to, we don't have to go ml-8 pixels. We could also go -ml for margin left and add 8 pixels in there. So this will also produce a margin left of -8 pixels. So either way is fine. And again, it all comes down to readability and whichever you prefer. It doesn't matter which method you use for this because both are absolutely fine and both work exactly the same. So I'm going to go ahead and keep it as minus margin left and adding the 8 pixels in there, just so we've got a different variation to what we're used to with the other negative values in our project. Then we also want a 100% height, so we'll have an H full. We want some nice border radius, so let's add a rounded of full. And we also want a nice background gradient for this timeline line. So we'll go from a sort of dark blue going to a more sort of bluey greeny color. So back in our code then, let's add a BG gradient to B, which stands for to the bottom. So we can see here the gradient will be to bottom. So instead of specifying 2 values here, so instead of specifying the from color and the to color, I want to specify 3 colors. So first of all, let's just do the from and to colors. So we want to go from sky 900 to teal 900. So let's save this now and take a look in the browser. And let's give it a refresh and let's scroll down to our timeline and we can see here, I'm going to go ahead and add a temporary fixed height for this timeline section here, just so we can see the timeline line a little bit bigger. So for this div here, I'm just going to go ahead and add a height of 250 pixels. So I'm going to save this. And now refresh, and there we go. Our timeline line is a little bit bigger now. So instead of specifying just 2 values here, so the value to start the gradient at and the value to end the gradient at, we can also specify any number of values in between. So if we go back to our code, for our timeline line, we can go from sky 900 to teal 900, but we can also go via any other color. So for example, if I go via pink 500, let's save this and take a look in the browser. Let's give it a refresh. We can see we start with sky 900, go to pink 500 and end on teal 500. However, this doesn't look so great. So I'm going to go via a little bit of a more subtle color and one that will suit the timeline a little bit nicer. So I'm going to go via cyan 900. So I'm going to save this now and take a look in the browser, give it a refresh, and this looks a lot nicer. It's a bit more subtle, the color in the middle. However, this is how we can add multiple gradients and multiple colors for our gradient using this via class. So one more thing I want to add before we move on to the next lecture and add the data for this timeline is I'm just going to add on our top level div here for our timeline, I'm going to add a rounded of large and I'm going to remove that fixed height. So let's save this now and take a look in the browser. Let's give it a refresh and there we go. We've got some nice border radius for our timeline. We're going to finish off our lineup timeline and we're going to do this with CSS Grid within Tailwind CSS. So back in our code then, let's go ahead and add our data. So we want to add our data underneath our timeline line. So underneath this timeline line div here, let's go ahead and add another div and we want to add a class name here and we want to add grid because we want to display as grid. And then we want to add grid cols2 because we want 2 columns per row in our timeline. So we'll have 1 column on the left and 1 column on the right, and they'll both have equal widths. So back in our code then, let's go ahead and add the first data item. And the first data item is this 1st of July date label. So let's go ahead and add another div. And within this div then, let's go ahead and add our 1st of July label. So we're going to add this in an H4 tag. And let's just go 1st of July in there. And we want to add a background color to this date label then. So let's go ahead and add a class name. And first of all, let's add a padding all round of 2. And let's add a background zinc of 900, as well as a rounded large. So we have a nice border radius. And let's add a margin top and bottom of 4. So let's save this and take a look in the browser to see what we've got. Let's give it a refresh. And there we go. We can see we've got our date label here now. However, the timeline line is slightly overlapping our date label. So let's go ahead and add a grid gap. So there's enough space between each of our columns per row, and it will also cater for our timeline line. So back in our code then, for our display grid. So let's go ahead and add a gap of 8, and let's save this and take a look in the browser now. Let's give it a refresh, and there we go. We've got some nice spacing between our columns, which also caters for our timeline line. So then let's go ahead and add our first band name in here. So we first of all need to add an empty column. So let's add an empty div here. And the reason we need to add an empty div here is because we don't have any data in the right-hand column. So this is the first column, which is the first div. This is the second column, which is the second div. However, it's going to be empty. There's going to be no data in it. So then the third column will wrap onto the next row because we only have 2 columns per row. So let's go ahead and add the data into our third div. So we'll add a third div here. And within here, this is where we're going to add the band name. So let's add a class of text right because we want to shift it to the right-hand side. And let's add our band name in a div here. And we want this to be font bold. So let's add our band name of Jackie Chaston, and then underneath the band name we want to add the time that she's playing. So let's go 6 p.m. on the Sage stage. So let's add a little bit of subtle text color to this then, so it's not as white as the rest of the text. So let's go text zinc 400, and let's save this and take a look in the browser now. If we give it a refresh, there we go. We've got our first band name here. So let's go ahead and add our second band name. However, we need to add 2 empty divs now because the next empty div will be the right-hand column. And then the second empty div will be the left-hand column on a new row. But then we want to add in the third div then, we want to add the next band name because we want to alternate each side our band names are on, but we need to make them start on a new row. So let's go back to our code then, and underneath Jackie Chaston, let's go ahead and add 2 empty divs. Then in the third div, we want the second band name. So I'm just going to copy Jackie Chaston and paste it in for the second band name. So let's go ahead and check in the browser then. Let's give it a refresh. And there we go. We have our second band name now on the right-hand side. So all we need to do now to repeat this layout is repeat our structure exactly the same as what we've already got for this 1st of July. So let's just go ahead and copy everything we've got for 1st of July. Let's paste it underneath what we've already got. Let's save this now and take a look in the browser. Let's give it a refresh, and there we go. We're just repeating exactly the same layout where we've got alternating band names on each side of our columns, but also starting on a new row. So the last thing we need to do now to finish off the timeline is add the little blinking dot here in the middle of the timeline line. So to do this is really easy. Let's go back to our code. And within our timeline line, within this div, let's go ahead and add another div. And this will be a position sticky because we want to make sure that if we take a look at the completed project, we want to make sure that this timeline pin stays in a fixed position, but only when we scroll down from the top of the timeline line down to the bottom of the timeline line. So we can see if we scroll up to the top of the timeline, it sticks to the top. And if we scroll down, then it's in a fixed position until it reaches the end of the timeline. So we want to add a position sticky, and we want to add a top of a half, which will give a top of 50%. Then within here, then let's add another div, and let's add a class, and we want a fixed height and width here. So this will be the circle for our timeline pin. So let's add relative in here, and let's add a height of 4 and a width of 4. Then within this div, we want to add our timeline pin and the pulsing effect for that pin. So we need 2 divs here. So the first div will be the pulsing effect, and the second div will be the actual pin. So let's do the second div first. Let's add a class name, and we want a background rows 500. We want rounded full. Let's give a position of relative. Let's give a height 4 and a width 4. So let's save this and take a look in the browser now just to see what we've got. So let's refresh now. We can see our pin is sitting nicely at the top of our timeline, but when we scroll down, we can see it follows our scroll of the page and then stops right at the bottom of the timeline. So all we need to do now then is add our pulse effect. So back in our code, for our first div, let's add a class, and exactly the same, we want to add a height of 4 and a width of 4. We want to animate ping. So this comes out of the box with Tailwind CSS. It's a ping animation that Tailwind CSS provides. So we don't need to do any custom animation here. Again, let's add a rounded of full, and let's add a background pink of 500 and an opacity of 75. So it's going to be slightly transparent. So let's save this now and take a look in the browser. Let's give it a refresh, and our ping is working. However, it's positioned incorrectly. So let's go back to our code and fix this. We just need to add a position of absolute to our ping. So if we save this then and refresh in the browser now, there we go. Our ping is positioned correctly behind our timeline pin. So one last thing we need to do to finish this off then, I don't know if you've already noticed this, but if we reduce the screen size, our toggle for our night and dark mode sits behind our timeline background, which isn't ideal. We need it to display on top of our timeline background. So just like what we did with the navbar, where we added a Z index, we're going to do exactly the same for our toggle button. So back in our code, if we scroll up and find our toggle button for our light and dark mode, it's right at the top of our markup. Within the header, we have our dark mode toggle. So again, we're just going to add a Z10, which will give a Z index of 10 for our dark mode toggle button. So let's save this now and take a look in the browser. Let's give it a refresh, and there we go. Our toggle button is sitting nicely on top of our timeline.